I built the $3.8 billion Atlas system that ran Cobecale Energy for 17 years. My wife's dad fired me in front of the entire board. Cobecale is a rocket ship, and we don't have room for anchors, he said, throwing my 50-page risk report in the trash. I nodded quietly and let security escort me out. Tomorrow's gonna be fun. My name's Adrian Holt, and if there's one thing you should know about me right off the bat, it's this. I don't build toys, I don't mess around with half-baked ideas, and I sure as hell don't waste 17 years of my life creating something that's just pretty good. No, I build empires that run themselves, systems so elegant and so brutally efficient that they could operate in their sleep while their creators sip overpriced coffee and pretend to care about quarterly earnings reports. For 17 long, grueling, occasionally soul-crushing years, I was the brain, the backbone, and the beating heart behind Atlas, a $3.8 billion AI system that managed every single contract, every compliance check, every financial heartbeat, and every microscopic transaction that kept Cobecale Energy from collapsing into a heap of legal violations and bankruptcy filings. Atlas wasn't just software. It was art. It was poetry written in Python and C++. And it was the only reason this company hadn't been sued into oblivion by every regulatory agency from here to Brussels. But then came Gerald Kale, my father-in-law and the company's self-appointed space commander, cosmic visionary, and professional motivational poster come to life, who decided one Tuesday morning that I was an anchor holding back his precious rocket ship. Yeah, you heard that right. An anchor. Me. The guy who literally kept the engines running while he was out there giving TED Talks about disrupting the energy paradigm and posting LinkedIn selfies with captions like, "Dream bigger, hustle harder, synergize vertically." I'm pretty sure Gerald thinks vertical synergy is an actual thing and not just what happens when you throw darts at a corporate jargon board after 3 martinis. The boardroom that particular morning smelled like burnt coffee, stale bagels, and the unmistakable scent of fear mixed with overpriced cologne. I walked in carrying a 50-page risk report, meticulously researched, footnoted, cross-referenced, and backed by enough data to make a statistics professor weep with joy. It detailed every single red flag, every potential landmine, and every catastrophic legal consequence of the pending merger Gerald was so excited about. This wasn't some vague, I have a bad feeling kind of document. This was basic math, cold hard numbers, the kind of stuff that should make any rational human being pump the brakes and maybe, I don't know, consult an actual expert before driving the company off a cliff. I dropped that report on the polished mahogany table with a satisfying thud, the kind of sound that says, "Pay attention, this matters." Gerald barely glanced at it. He picked it up like it was a takeout menu he didn't order, flipped through maybe 3 pages with the attention span of a goldfish on Red Bull, and then, I kid you not, he laughed. Not a polite chuckle, not a nervous, interesting laugh, but a full-blown, condescending, "Oh, you poor paranoid little man," laugh that echoed off the walls and made everyone else in the room shift uncomfortably in their ergonomic chairs. "Adrian," he said, still grinning like he'd just heard the world's funniest knock-knock joke. "This is paranoia. Pure, unfiltered paranoia. We're building a rocket ship here, buddy, and you're over here worried about seat belts and fire extinguishers." He tossed my report in the trash can next to his chair, the same trash can where someone had thrown away a banana peel and a crumpled napkin, and let it sit there like it was no different from yesterday's lunch garbage. "We don't need anchors, Adrian. We need visionaries. We need people who can see the future, not people who are stuck in spreadsheets and worst-case scenarios." I nodded slowly, keeping my face perfectly neutral, adjusted my tie, and thought to myself with the kind of calm clarity that only comes when you know you're about to watch someone learn a very expensive lesson. "Perfect. Let's see how your rocket flies without the engine, Gerald. Let's see how far you get when the guy who built the entire navigation system, fuel management protocol, and emergency landing sequence isn't around to keep your shiny little spacecraft from exploding on the launch pad." Security showed up about 3 minutes later, 2 guys in matching blazers who looked like they'd rather be literally anywhere else, flanking me on each side like I was some kind of corporate criminal being perp-walked out of a crime scene. They didn't say much, just the usual, "We need you to come with us" routine, and I didn't resist because honestly, what was the point? I'd already seen this coming from a mile away. As they escorted me down the hallway past the open plan office where my former colleagues suddenly became very interested in their computer screens, I waved at the receptionist, gave her my best casual Friday smile, the kind that says, "Hey, no hard feelings, just another Tuesday." And she looked at me like I'd just told her the building was on fire. I walked out those glass doors, felt the cool autumn air hit my face, and made myself a promise right then and there, standing on the sidewalk, while some junior analyst nervously avoided eye contact as he scurried past me. Tomorrow was going to be very, very fun. Not fun in the let's grab drinks and laugh about old times kind of way, but fun in the let's watch a self-important CEO realize he just fired the only person who knew where all the bodies were buried kind of way. Gerald wanted a rocket ship? Fine. He was about to learn that rocket ships don't fly without engineers, and engines don't run without the people who built them. I got into my car, turned on some jazz because I'm classy like that, and drove home with the windows down, letting the wind mess up my hair, because honestly, who cared anymore? I wasn't an employee. I wasn't bound by non-competes or corporate politeness or the need to pretend Gerald's ideas made sense. I was free, and freedom, as it turns out, tastes a lot like revenge served cold with a side of "I told you so." My phone was already buzzing with texts from colleagues, some sympathetic, some confused, some probably just nosy, but I ignored them all. There'd be time for explanations later, time for the whole story to come out, time for everyone to realize what had actually just happened in that boardroom. For now, I just drove, smiled to myself, and started mentally preparing for phase 2 of a plan I'd put in place years ago, back when I first realized that Gerald Kale was the kind of man who'd rather look visionary than be competent. Some people learn from their mistakes. Some people learn from other people's mistakes. And then there's Gerald, who apparently needed to learn from a full-scale corporate meltdown orchestrated by the son-in-law he just threw away like trash. Tomorrow morning, the real fun would begin, and I couldn't wait to watch it unfold from the comfort of my living room, probably in pajamas, definitely with good tea, absolutely with the kind of satisfaction that only comes from being right when everyone else thought you were crazy. They call me an anchor. Fair enough. But anchors don't just hold things down. They also keep ships from drifting into rocks and sinking to the bottom of the ocean. Gerald was about to find out which one his company was heading for, and spoiler alert, it wasn't going to be a smooth journey. That night, after the world's most awkward car ride home where I listened to smooth jazz and contemplated the beautiful chaos I was about to unleash, I walked into my house and did what any recently unemployed tech genius would do. I brewed my favorite Darjeeling silver leaf tea, the good kind that costs more per ounce than most people's lunch, not the sad office kitchen tea bag flavor of despair that tastes like disappointment and broken dreams steeped in lukewarm water. This was the premium stuff, loose leaf, imported, the kind of tea that makes you feel like you've got your life together even when you've just been escorted out of your own company by security guards who looked more uncomfortable than you did. My wife, Melissa, was sitting on the couch in our absurdly expensive living room that her father had helped us invest in, which was code for, "I bought you this house, so you'd feel obligated to worship me forever." She was doing that thing where she pretended to be absorbed in her phone, but was actually avoiding eye contact like I had suddenly developed a contagious disease. Her thumb scrolled through Pinterest with the kind of aggressive focus that only comes when you're trying very hard not to talk about the elephant in the room, or in this case, the fired husband making tea in the kitchen. I could see her screen from where I stood. Vision boards, manifesting abundance, 10 ways to stay positive when life gets hard, and my personal favorite, how to support your spouse during career transitions, which she clearly wasn't reading because supporting me would require acknowledging my existence. Her dad was her hero, the man who gave me a job 17 years ago when I was fresh out of grad school with more student debt than common sense, and apparently, he'd also given himself permission to humiliate me whenever he felt like it. In Melissa's world, Gerald could do no wrong. He was the successful CEO, the self-made billionaire, the guy who turned a regional energy company into a national powerhouse, and I was just the tech guy, the behind-the-scenes person, the one who made sure the lights stayed on while Gerald took all the credit and the magazine covers. While she scrolled through her digital fantasy land of perfect homes and motivational quotes, I scrolled through something infinitely more important on my encrypted tablet, the one I kept in my study that she thought I used for boring work stuff, and probably video games or something. The app was called Covenant, and let me tell you, it wasn't available in any app store, didn't have a cute icon, and definitely wasn't going to help me manifest my dreams unless my dreams involved corporate espionage and righteous revenge. See, here's the thing that Gerald and his merry band of business school graduates never bothered to understand. Atlas wasn't just software. It wasn't just some program you install, update once a year, and forget about until it crashes during a crucial presentation. Atlas was a living, breathing organism, wired into every single department of Cobecale Energy like a nervous system, connecting everything from payroll to procurement, from compliance to contracts, from the CEO's calendar to the janitor's supply orders. It saw everything, knew everything, and remembered everything. And I had built it with one very special, very secret line of code that only I knew existed, buried so deep in the system architecture that you'd need a PhD in computer science and about 6 months of free time to even find it, let alone understand what it did. I called it the Covenant Protocol because I'm dramatic like that, and also because it sounded way cooler than emergency revenge subroutine or the Gerald is an idiot failsafe. The protocol was elegant in its simplicity. If the system detected my termination without a proper 2/3 board vote, not just Gerald throwing a tantrum and calling security, but an actual legitimate vote following proper corporate governance procedures, Atlas would interpret my firing as an act of corporate treason, a hostile takeover, a cyber attack from within. And within 24 hours of detecting this unauthorized termination, it would trigger a lockdown sequence that would make Fort Knox look like a public library. The beauty of it was that I designed this failsafe years ago, back when I first started noticing that Gerald treated the company like his personal playground and employees like disposable action figures. I'd buried the code in a routine system update, disguised it as a security enhancement, got it approved by the board who didn't bother reading the technical specifications because let's be honest, most board members think coding is something you do with secret messages and decoder rings. Nobody knew it existed except me, and now, sitting in my kitchen with my fancy tea and my encrypted tablet, I was about to activate it. Melissa finally looked up from her phone, her perfectly highlighted hair catching the light from the chandelier her father bought us, and asked with the kind of forced casualness that screamed, "I'm trying to act normal, but I'm actually freaking out. What are you working on?" Her eyes darted to my tablet, and then back to my face, trying to read my expression like I was a book written in a language she didn't quite speak. "Just cleaning up some files," I said, giving her my most innocent smile, the one I used when I wanted to seem harmless and slightly boring, like I was organizing vacation photos or deleting old emails. She didn't know that those files I was cleaning up were about to flip her father's multi-billion-dollar empire upside down, shake it like a snow globe, and watch all the dirty secrets fall out like confetti at the world's worst party. She didn't know that in approximately 18 hours, her father was going to have the worst day of his professional life, and it was going to be entirely his own fault for throwing away the one person who actually understood how his company worked. I took another sip of my tea, savoring the delicate flavor, the subtle notes of muscatel and honey, and pulled up the Covenant interface on my tablet. The screen glowed softly in the dimming light of our kitchen, lines of code scrolling past like poetry, like a beautiful symphony of ones and zeros that were about to conduct the most spectacular corporate takedown this industry had ever seen. I'd tested this protocol 100 times in isolated environments, run every simulation, checked every possible outcome, and I knew exactly what would happen when I pressed that execute button. Atlas would lock down. Every high-level administrative account would be frozen. Every financial transaction would halt mid-process. Every contract would require my personal authorization to proceed. The company would effectively be paralyzed, unable to pay vendors, unable to process payroll, unable to do anything except sit there and realize that maybe, just maybe, firing your lead systems architect without a proper termination process was a spectacularly bad idea. Melissa went back to her phone, apparently satisfied with my boring explanation, and I went back to my tablet, reading through the protocol one more time, not because I needed to check it, but because I wanted to savor this moment, this calm before the storm, this last peaceful evening before I turned Gerald's world into a living nightmare of frozen accounts and panicked phone calls. The Covenant protocol wasn't about revenge, not really. though I'd be lying if I said that wasn't a delicious side benefit. It was about accountability. It was about showing everyone what happens when you treat people like disposable resources instead of human beings. It was about proving that you can't just fire the person who built your entire infrastructure and expect everything to keep running smoothly. It was about teaching Gerald Kale a lesson he should have learned in business school, but apparently skipped because he was too busy practicing his visionary speeches in the mirror. I finished my tea, rinsed the cup in the sink like a civilized human being, and headed to my study with my tablet tucked under my arm. Melissa called out something about dinner, probably asking if I wanted to order takeout since neither of us felt like cooking after the day we'd had, but I barely heard her. My mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow morning, imagining the chaos, the confusion, the absolute beautiful pandemonium that was about to erupt in that pristine glass tower where I'd spent 17 years of my life. As I closed the study door behind me and sat down at my desk, I whispered to myself, to the empty room, to Atlas somewhere out there in the digital ether waiting for my command. Let's see your rocket fly now, Dad. And then I smiled, the kind of smile that probably would have worried Melissa if she could see it, and started preparing to press the button that would change everything. Let's take a moment to really talk about Gerald Kale, because honestly, the man deserves his own chapter dedicated to the art of sounding important while saying absolutely nothing of substance. Imagine if Buzzword Bingo had a human form, grew legs, put on a $3,000 suit, and decided to run a Fortune 500 company. That's Gerald. The man could turn a simple yes or no question into a 15-minute TED Talk about synergizing our core competencies and leveraging our strategic assets in the marketplace of tomorrow. He loved, and I mean absolutely loved, saying things like, we need to actionize our deliverables and maximize our synergies across all vertical touchpoints, while maintaining our forward momentum paradigm shift. I swear to God, he said that in a meeting once, and 3 people actually nodded like it meant something. Translation for those of us living in reality. I have no idea what I'm talking about, but it sounds expensive, important, and vaguely scientific, so everyone will assume I'm a genius instead of calling me out for speaking complete nonsense. Gerald surrounded himself with a team of professional hype men, guys who made their living by inventing job titles that sounded impressive but meant absolutely nothing. We had a chief visionary officer whose job, as far as I could tell, consisted of walking around with a tablet showing everyone graphs that trended upward regardless of what they were measuring. We had an innovation evangelist who spent most of his time posting motivational quotes on the company's internal social network and organizing trust fall exercises that nobody wanted to participate in. And my personal favorite, the crown jewel of useless corporate positions, the disruption architect, a guy named Brad who wore exclusively black turtlenecks, carried a Moleskine notebook everywhere, and claimed to be redesigning the conversation around energy consumption, when literally all he did was rename existing departments and call it innovation. None of these clowns, not a single one, could code their way out of a Wi-Fi login page. I'm not even exaggerating. I once watched the chief visionary officer spend 20 minutes trying to connect to the guest network because he couldn't figure out where to enter the password. This was the guy Gerald trusted to spearhead our digital transformation initiative. The same guy who thought the cloud was an actual cloud and asked me, in a meeting with investors, if we needed to worry about rain affecting our data storage. I wish I was making this up. Meanwhile, while these guys were busy disrupting paradigms and evangelizing innovation, I was in my office running actual simulations, crunching real numbers, and predicting billion-dollar lawsuits that were heading toward us like freight trains toward someone tied to the tracks. I had spreadsheets that would make a mathematician weep with joy, risk assessments that detailed every possible regulatory violation, and compliance reports that showed exactly how many laws we were about to break with this merger Gerald was so excited about. But sure, let's ignore the guy who actually knows what he's talking about and listen to Brad the disruption architect explain how we need to gamify our stakeholder engagement protocols. Gerald's favorite move, his signature technique that he pulled out whenever someone questioned his decisions, was what I called the motivational slideshow maneuver. He'd fire up PowerPoint, and I swear this presentation was always ready to go like he kept it bookmarked for emergencies, and he'd show us slide after slide of stock photos. Rockets launching into space. Mountains with people standing on top, raising their arms victoriously. bridges connecting impossible distances, oceans with sailboats cutting through waves. And every single slide had some inspirational quote in a font that was way too large. Things like, "The only limit is the one you set yourself," or "Dream bigger than your fears," or my absolute favorite, "Winners don't wait for permission to be great." And people ate it up. They actually sat there, grown adults with college degrees and mortgages, nodding along like Gerald had just revealed the secrets of the universe instead of showing them the corporate equivalent of a Pinterest board. Meanwhile, I'd be sitting in the back of the room calculating exactly how much money we were about to lose and wondering if anyone else in this conference room understood that rockets need fuel, engineering, and actual physics to fly, not just motivational quotes and good vibes. The thing that really got me, the part that made me want to scream into a pillow, was that Gerald genuinely believed he was a genius. He'd look at Atlas, this incredibly complex system that took me years to build, that required understanding machine learning, neural networks, database architecture, and about 17 different programming languages, and he'd say things like, "Yeah, Adrian built this, but really it was my vision that made it possible." His vision, like he'd done anything except sign the checks and take credit during press conferences. He'd introduce me at company events as our tech guy, like I was the person who fixed the printer when it jammed, not the person who built the entire digital infrastructure that kept this company from collapsing into legal chaos. And whenever something went wrong, whenever Atlas flagged a problem or I brought up a concern, Gerald would wave it off with some variation of, "That's just the risk of being disruptive," or "You can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs," which is great advice if you're making breakfast, but terrible advice if you're running a multi-billion-dollar corporation that's being investigated by 3 different regulatory agencies. But sure, Gerald, let's blame the guy who actually knew what a line of code looks like. Let's fire the person who spent 17 years making sure your rocket ship didn't explode on the launch pad. Let's toss his risk report in the trash and call him an anchor while you and your team of buzzword enthusiasts steer this company straight into an iceberg. That'll work out great. I'm sure Brad the disruption architect has a motivational quote ready for when the lawsuits start rolling in. By 9 o'clock in the morning, after I'd enjoyed a leisurely breakfast of scrambled eggs, toast with actual butter because I'm not some kind of animal who uses margarine, and a fresh pot of my favorite coffee, my phone started vibrating like a blender on high speed, like it was having some kind of electronic seizure, like every person who'd ever had my number suddenly remembered I existed and decided right now was the perfect time to reach out. The notifications were coming in so fast that my phone was practically doing a little dance across the kitchen counter, buzzing and dinging and lighting up with such enthusiasm that I half expected it to achieve sentience and start begging me to make it stop. My insider at IT, Leo Tran, a guy I'd mentored for years and who still had the good sense to stay loyal to the person who'd actually taught him useful skills rather than the CEO, who couldn't tell the difference between RAM and a random access memory joke, texted me at exactly 9:03 in the morning with a message that was somehow both panicked and delighted. Atlas rejecting all logins. Payments frozen. CFO just fainted. The message was followed by 3 skull emojis and 1 rocket emoji, which I appreciated because Leo understood both the gravity of the situation and the beautiful irony of Gerald's precious rocket ship metaphor coming back to haunt him in the most literal way possible. I could picture the scene perfectly, having spent enough time in that office to know exactly how this kind of chaos would unfold. The IT department, usually a quiet corner of the building where people spoke in hushed tones about server maintenance and software updates, would be in complete pandemonium right now. Every phone ringing off the hook, every desk surrounded by confused executives demanding to know why they couldn't access their accounts, why their passwords weren't working, why the system kept telling them authorization required. Contact System Administrator, which was hilarious because I was the system administrator and I was currently eating toast in my pajamas. By 9:15, just 12 minutes into this beautiful disaster, trading was halted on the New York Stock Exchange. CodeKale Energy's stock, which had been doing reasonably well despite Gerald's best efforts to run the company into the ground through sheer incompetence and buzzword addiction, suddenly froze mid-trading session. The automatic circuit breakers kicked in when the system detected unusual activity, which is stock market speak for something is very wrong and we need everyone to stop touching things until we figure out what's happening. I imagined traders staring at their screens in confusion, frantically calling their contacts at the company, getting nothing but busy signals and panicked receptionists who had no idea what to tell them. By 9:30, and this is where it got really good, where the schadenfreude reached levels that probably aren't healthy for normal human beings, but felt absolutely perfect to me. Melissa's father was on live television doing damage control. I switched on CNBC, that financial news channel that normal people ignore, but which becomes incredibly entertaining when your father-in-law is melting down on national television. And there he was, Gerald Kale, in all his expensive suited glory, standing outside the company headquarters with a microphone in his face, and that particular expression people get when they're trying very hard to look calm while internally screaming. He was trying, bless his delusional heart, to assure investors that everything was under control, that this was just a minor technical glitch, that the company's robust systems and dedicated IT team were working to resolve the issue, and that there was absolutely no cause for concern. His eye was twitching slightly, that little tell that I'd learned to recognize over the years of watching him lie his way through board meetings and investor calls, the tiny muscle spasm that said, I am absolutely panicking, but I'm going to smile through it, because that's what CEOs do. The reporter kept asking increasingly pointed questions about cybersecurity and whether this was a hack, and Gerald kept deflecting with corporate non-answers that meant absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, I was in my living room wearing the most comfortable pajamas I owned, the ones with little cartoons on them that Melissa had bought me as a joke gift, but which had turned out to be legitimately amazing, eating pancakes that I'd made from scratch, because apparently unemployment gave me time to actually cook proper breakfast instead of grabbing a granola bar on my way out the door. I was watching the chaos unfold like it was the season finale of my favorite show, except better because I'd written the script and directed every scene and knew exactly how it was going to end. The pancakes were perfect, fluffy and golden brown with just the right amount of maple syrup, the real expensive stuff from Vermont, not that fake corn syrup garbage, and I savored every bite while watching Gerald's empire crumble in real time on my television screen. This was what peak satisfaction looked like, what revenge tasted like when you cooked it low and slow over 17 years of preparation and planning and waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. When Melissa finally emerged from the bedroom, still in her robe and looking like she'd slept terribly, which was probably because her phone had also been blowing up with panic calls from her family, she turned on the news and gasped like someone had just told her the world was ending. Her hand flew to her mouth in that dramatic way people do when they're genuinely shocked, and she stared at the television screen where her father was sweating through his shirt on national television while trying to explain why his company had suddenly frozen like a computer from 1995. She turned to look at me, her eyes wide with that mixture of confusion and dawning realization, and asked in a voice that was trying very hard to sound casual, but came out sounding strangled and panicked. Adrian, did you have something to do with this? I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, the kind of sip that's more about making a point than actually drinking the beverage, and looked at her with the most innocent expression I could manage, which probably wasn't very convincing, but I didn't really care at this point. Sweetheart, I said, letting the word hang in the air for a moment. I'm unemployed. How could I possibly be this productive? Then I turned back to the television and took another bite of my pancakes while her father's stock price plummeted in the little ticker at the bottom of the screen. At 11:43 in the morning, right when I was considering whether to make myself a second pot of coffee or switch to tea, because I'm civilized like that and understand the importance of beverage variety throughout the day, my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately. It was Andrew Holtman, the head partner at Sterling & Pierce, one of those white shoe law firms with offices that look like they were decorated by someone who thought mahogany and leather were the only acceptable building materials and whose hourly rates could finance a small country's educational system. Andrew was the guy who managed the Kobe family trust, the same trust that held the controlling shares of the company, the same trust that Gerald thought he controlled, but actually didn't because his father had been way smarter than his son and had built in some very interesting safeguards that apparently nobody had bothered to read in detail. I let the phone ring twice before answering, not because I was playing hard to get, but because I was genuinely trying to decide if I wanted to have this conversation while sitting down or standing up, whether I should sound concerned or amused, whether I should pretend I had no idea what was happening or just skip straight to the part where I explained exactly how Gerald had screwed himself. I went with sitting down at my kitchen table with my coffee, because comfort is important even during moments of corporate warfare, and answered with a casual hello, Andrew. That probably sounded way too relaxed for someone whose former company was currently having a very public meltdown. Adrian, he said, and his voice had that particular quality that lawyers get when they're trying very hard to sound professional and calm, but are actually internally freaking out. Like he'd just discovered that the Titanic was sinking, and he was the guy responsible for explaining it to the passengers. What's happening? The entire board is calling me. Gerald is calling me. Investors are calling me, and nobody can access anything. The system is completely locked down, and every attempt to override it is being rejected. We have payments that need to go out, contracts that need to be signed, and Atlas is treating every single login attempt like it's a cyber attack. I took a sip of my coffee, let him stew in that panic for just a moment longer than was probably polite, and then said with the kind of calm that only comes when you've planned something down to the last detail and watched it unfold exactly as you predicted. Check Section 4B of the founder's documents. Then I hung up, just clicked the end call button, and set my phone down on the table like I'd just finished the world's most boring conversation about what to have for lunch. Not a conversation that was about to blow apart Gerald's entire understanding of who actually owned the company he thought was his personal playground. The founder's documents, for anyone who doesn't spend their free time reading corporate governance paperwork like it's a thrilling mystery novel, were the original agreements that Gerald's father, the actual founder of Cobecale Energy, had put in place when he established the company back in the 1980s. These weren't the sanitized, simplified versions that got presented to new board members or included in the annual reports. These were the real, complete, full of legal landmines documents that outlined exactly how the company was supposed to be run and what happened if people violated those rules. Section 4B, specifically, was a beautiful piece of legal engineering that Gerald's father had included because, and I'm just speculating here based on 17 years of watching Family Dynamics, he didn't entirely trust his son to run the company without adult supervision. It stated, in very clear legal language that even lawyers couldn't misinterpret no matter how hard they tried, that if the company ever fired its chief systems architect, the person responsible for building and maintaining the core operational infrastructure, without a proper two-thirds supermajority vote of the board of directors following all appropriate corporate governance procedures, the termination would be considered invalid and potentially hostile. But here's where it got really interesting, where the founder's paranoia and my own planning had intersected in the most beautiful way possible. The document went on to specify that in the event of such an invalid termination, ownership of the company's controlling shares, the ones held in the Kobe family trust, would automatically transfer to a protection trust established for the architect's benefit until such time as the board could demonstrate proper governance procedures had been followed. It was basically a dead man's switch built into the corporate structure, a fail-safe designed to prevent exactly the kind of impulsive, ego-driven decision-making that Gerald specialized in. The beauty of the Covenant Protocol was its simplicity, the way it connected the technical infrastructure with the legal framework in a way that nobody had anticipated because they'd never bothered to read both sets of documents carefully enough to see how they fit together. When Atlas detected my unauthorized termination, it didn't just lock down the systems for security purposes, it also automatically triggered the legal provisions in Section 4B by sending certified notifications to the trust's legal custodians, which happened to be Sterling and Pierce, Andrew's firm, by noon, and I know this because Leo was still texting me updates like he was providing live commentary on the world's best sporting event. Every legal team in the building was trying to figure out how their CEO had just been legally outplayed by his son-in-law, who was currently sitting at home in sweatpants eating leftover pancakes and looking entirely too pleased with himself. The conference rooms were full of lawyers, actual rooms full of people in suits who charged hundreds of dollars per hour, all frantically reading through documents that some of them were seeing for the first time despite having been on retainer for years. Andrew called back 17 minutes later, which I knew because I'd been watching the clock and wondering how long it would take him to find Section 4B, read it, understand it, confirm it with his partners, have a minor panic attack, and then call me back. Adrian, he said, And this time his voice had shifted from panic to that special tone lawyers use when they've realized they're dealing with someone who knows exactly what they're doing and has somehow managed to be technically legal while still being completely devastating. We need to talk about this. The provisions in Section 4B they're very clear, but surely we can come to some kind of arrangement. What kind of arrangement? I asked, still sipping my coffee, still sitting at my kitchen table, still wearing sweatpants that had a small syrup stain on them from breakfast that I hadn't bothered to clean up, because honestly, who was I trying to impress? An arrangement where Gerald admits he violated corporate governance procedures and illegally terminated me? An arrangement where the board acknowledges that they allowed the CEO to act unilaterally without proper oversight? Or an arrangement where everyone just pretends this didn't happen and hopes the problem goes away? There was a long silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that meant Andrew was conferring with other people in the room, probably a whole crowd of partners and associates all listening on speakerphone and trying to figure out if there was any legal loophole they could exploit, any technicality they could use to avoid the obvious conclusion that Gerald had screwed up so badly that he'd accidentally handed control of his own company to the guy he'd just fired. The trust provisions are very specific, Andrew finally said, choosing his words carefully like he was defusing a bomb made of legal terminology. If what the system is claiming is accurate, and if the termination wasn't properly authorized, then technically, according to the founders' documents, the controlling shares would transfer to your protective trust until proper procedures are followed. But Adrian, this could destroy the company. The stock is already down 18%, trading is halted, and if this gets out, if investors find out that there's a legal battle over ownership, it could trigger a complete collapse. Then I guess, I said, finishing my coffee and setting the mug down with a gentle click that somehow felt more dramatic than it should have. Gerald should have followed proper procedures before firing me. He should have called a board meeting, presented his case, allowed for discussion and debate, and held a proper vote like the founders' documents required. Instead, he threw my report in the trash and called security because his ego couldn't handle someone telling him he was wrong. That's not my problem, Andrew. That's his problem. And now it's yours. I could hear muffled arguing in the background, multiple voices trying to figure out what to do, how to handle this, whether they should try to negotiate or lawyer their way out of it, or just accept that sometimes people create consequences for themselves that no amount of expensive legal representation can fix. What do you want? Andrew finally asked, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice, the sound of a man who'd just realized his entire day, week, possibly month was going to be consumed by this disaster. What do I want? I repeated, pretending to think about it, even though I'd known exactly what I wanted since the moment Gerald threw my report away. I want proper corporate governance. I want a board that actually reads the documents they're supposed to be overseeing. I want a CEO who understands that you can't just fire people because they hurt your feelings. And I want Gerald to understand that rocket ships don't fly on buzzwords and motivational speeches. They fly on engineering and people who actually know what they're doing. I hung up before he could respond, because sometimes the best way to end a conversation is to not let the other person have the last word, and also because I needed to use the bathroom, and this seemed like a natural stopping point. As I walked away from my kitchen table, leaving my phone buzzing with incoming calls that I had no intention of answering, I smiled to myself and thought about how Gerald's father, a man I'd only met a few times before he passed away, had somehow known that his son would need protection from himself, had built in safeguards that would outlive him and activate at exactly the right moment to save the company from Gerald's worst impulses. The old man had been smarter than anyone gave him credit for, and right now, from W. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right W ass off. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right when I was settling into my couch with a book I'd been meaning to read for about 6 months, one of those thick literary novels that people buy to look smart but never actually finish because life gets in the way, my doorbell rang with the kind of aggressive, repeated pressing that suggested whoever was on the other side had completely abandoned the concept of patience and was operating on pure adrenaline and rage. I knew exactly who it was before I even got up from the couch, before I marked my page and set the book down, before I walked across my living room floor in my socks, because I'd kicked off my shoes earlier and saw no reason to put them back on for this particular visitor. Gerald stood there on my front porch, drenched from the rain that had started about an hour ago, One of those sudden autumn downpours that comes out of nowhere and makes everyone regret not checking the weather forecast. His $8,000 suit, the one he'd probably had custom made in Italy by some tailor whose waiting list was longer than most people's mortgage terms, was clinging to him like plastic wrap, soaked through and probably ruined beyond repair, which gave me a small spark of joy that I'm not particularly proud of, but also not ashamed enough to feel bad about. His hair, usually perfectly styled with whatever expensive product made it look like he'd just stepped out of a boardroom photo shoot, was plastered to his forehead in sad, wet strands that made him look less like a powerful CEO and more like a drowned cat who'd had a very bad day. He didn't wait for me to invite him in, didn't bother with pleasantries or social niceties or any of the normal conventions of human interaction. He just shoved past me the moment I opened the door, leaving wet footprints on my hardwood floor that Melissa was definitely going to complain about later, and started yelling before he'd even made it fully into the living room. "What did you do, Adrian?" His voice was so loud that I genuinely worried about the neighbors hearing, not because I cared what they thought, but because I didn't want to deal with noise complaints on top of everything else. "The company's locked down. Everything is frozen. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I closed the front door calmly, took a moment to appreciate the contrast between his chaotic energy and my complete serenity, and walked past him to the kitchen to get myself a glass of water because all this drama was making me thirsty. "Sounds like a software issue," I said, my voice deliberately casual, the tone you'd use to discuss the weather or what you had for lunch, not the complete meltdown of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. "You should call IT. "Oh wait, you can't log in to do that, can you? That's unfortunate." His face went through several interesting color changes, starting at normal human skin tone, moving through various shades of red, and ending somewhere in the purple family that suggested his blood pressure had reached levels that would concern any reasonable doctor. He followed me into the kitchen, leaving a trail of water droplets like some kind of angry, corporate Hansel and Gretel, and slammed his fist down on my dining table with enough force that my favorite spoon, the one I'd been using earlier for my yogurt, actually jumped into the air and did a little flip before landing on the floor with a clatter that seemed inappropriately cheerful for the mood of the conversation. "This isn't funny, Adrian," he shouted, and I noticed that little vein in his forehead was throbbing, the one that always appeared during particularly stressful board meetings or when someone challenged his ideas with actual facts and data. "The stock is in free fall. We have billions of dollars in transactions that can't process. Payroll is frozen. Do you understand what that means? People won't get paid. Vendors won't get paid. We have contracts that are going to default because we can't access the system to execute them." I picked up my spoon from the floor, rinsed it off in the sink because I'm not a savage, and then turned to face him with the kind of calm that I knew would infuriate him even more than yelling would. "Gee, Gerald, that sounds really serious. Almost like you should have thought about these consequences before you fired the person who built the system that manages all of those things. Almost like you should have followed proper corporate governance procedures instead of having a temper tantrum and calling security. But hey, what do I know? I'm just the paranoid anchor who got thrown away like trash, remember?" He opened his mouth to respond, probably to launch into another tirade about how this was all my fault and I was being unreasonable and didn't I care about the innocent employees who would be affected by this. But I wasn't done yet, and I'd been waiting 17 years to say some of this stuff out loud. "You want to know what I did, Gerald? I'll tell you exactly what I did. I built a system with fail-safes, because that's what good engineers do. I built protections into the company's infrastructure because I understood, even if you didn't, that sometimes people make stupid decisions, and the system needs to protect itself from those decisions. Your father understood this too, by the way. He's the one who wrote Section 4B into the founder's documents." I walked over to where my laptop was sitting on the dining room table, opened it up, and pulled up the document that I'd bookmarked weeks ago, knowing this moment would eventually come. The screen showed the covenant document, the founder's original incorporation papers and trust agreements, all the legal framework that Gerald had apparently never bothered to read despite being the CEO of the company his father had built. "This right here," I said, turning the laptop so he could see it. "This is what your father signed 37 years ago when he founded the company. See that signature? That's his. See that date? That's 1988, before you even joined the company. Back when your father still had hopes that maybe you'd turn out to be someone who actually understood business instead of just being good at looking important in photographs. Gerald's face, which I didn't think could get any more colorful, somehow managed to find a new shade that existed somewhere between purple and what I can only describe as expired shrimp. He leaned over the laptop, his wet hair dripping onto my keyboard, which was extremely annoying, but I let it slide because this moment was too good to interrupt with complaints about water damage and read the section I'd highlighted for him. I watched his eyes move across the screen, watched the exact moment when the words penetrated his skull and he understood what had happened, what his father had done, what I had activated. "This is fraud," he shouted, backing away from the laptop like it had personally insulted him, his voice cracking slightly, which would have been sad if he wasn't such an insufferable human being. "This is manipulation. This is some kind of technicality that doesn't count. You can't just take over a company because of some obscure clause in a document nobody's looked at in decades." "No," I said, and my voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath it now, the kind of tone that made it clear I was done playing nice, done being polite, done pretending that any of this was anything other than exactly what it looked like. "This is backup planning. This is what happens when a smart man who built something from nothing understands that his son might not be capable of protecting that legacy. Your father believed in succession planning, in corporate governance, in having systems in place to prevent disasters. You believed in slogans and rocket ship metaphors and firing people who told you things you didn't want to hear." Gerald stood there, trembling now, not from the cold of his wet clothes, but from rage and shock and the dawning realization that he'd been completely, utterly, devastatingly outmaneuvered by the son-in-law he'd never taken seriously, the tech guy he thought was just there to keep the computers running while the real business happened elsewhere. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment I genuinely wondered if he was going to try to hit me, which would have been interesting because I'm pretty sure assault charges on top of everything else would have been the perfect cherry on top of this disaster sundae he'd created for himself. "You," he said, his voice low and shaking, pointing one finger at me like he was cursing me in some kind of corporate voodoo ritual. "You have destroyed everything. My company, my reputation, my family. Melissa will never forgive you for this. You've ruined your own marriage over some petty revenge scheme because your feelings got hurt." I laughed, actually laughed out loud, because the audacity of this man to play the victim after everything he'd done was so absurd it bordered on comedic genius. "My feelings got hurt. Gerald, you threw away a 50-page risk analysis like it was junk mail. You called me paranoid for doing my job. You fired me without following any proper procedures because your ego couldn't handle being wrong. And now you're standing in my house, dripping water all over my floor, yelling at me about revenge? This isn't revenge. This is consequences. There's a difference, and the fact that you can't tell them apart is exactly why your father wrote that clause in the first place." He left then, storming out of my house without another word, slamming the door so hard that a picture frame on the wall rattled and nearly fell off its hook. Through the window, I watched him stumble to his car, get in, sit there for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel, and I swear I could see his shoulders shaking like he was either crying or laughing or having some kind of breakdown that combined elements of both. Then he started the engine and drove away, leaving tire marks on my driveway that would probably never come out and would forever be a reminder of this perfect, terrible, absolutely justified day. I closed the door, locked it for good measure because who knew if he'd come back with reinforcements or lawyers or both, and walked back to my couch where my book was waiting patiently. As I picked it up and found my page again, I whispered to the empty room, to the silence that felt more peaceful than it had in years. "Good idea, Gerald. Bring lots of lawyers. You're going to need them." Then I smiled, settled back into the cushions, and continued reading my book like I hadn't just watched a man's entire world crumble in my living room while he dripped expensive rainwater all over my hardwood floors. 2 days later, after 72 hours of absolute chaos that I watched unfold from the comfort of my home, like it was the world's best reality TV show, I returned to the 48th floor of the Cobecale Energy Building, not as the fired employee who'd been escorted out by security guards who looked more uncomfortable than I did, not as the paranoid anchor who'd been thrown away like yesterday's garbage, but as the new majority shareholder with controlling interest in the company and the legal authority to do pretty much whatever I wanted within the bounds of corporate governance and common sense. The elevator ride up was surreal in the best possible way. That particular kind of surreal that comes when you're living through something you'd fantasized about, but never quite believed would actually happen. The same elevator I'd ridden thousands of times over 17 years, the same music playing overhead, the same slightly too bright LED lights that made everyone look vaguely jaundiced. But this time, everything felt different because I wasn't going up to beg for my job back or negotiate some kind of settlement. I was going up to take over, and the difference between those two scenarios was absolutely delicious. The guards who had literally, physically escorted me out of the building just days ago, one on each arm like I was some kind of corporate criminal being perp-walked to my execution, now stood at attention and held the glass doors open for me with the kind of respect that comes from suddenly realizing the person you manhandled is now technically your boss. They didn't say anything, probably had been explicitly instructed not to say anything by someone in HR who was desperately trying to avoid any additional lawsuits or embarrassing incidents. But their eyes told the whole story. Confusion, embarrassment, maybe a little fear about whether I was the kind of person who held grudges against security guards who were just doing their jobs. I nodded at them politely as I walked through, because I'm not a monster who punishes people for following orders, and made my way down the hallway toward the main conference room where the emergency board meeting had been called. My footsteps echoed on the polished marble floors, that same expensive flooring that Gerald had insisted on installing 5 years ago, because apparently regular floors weren't impressive enough for his vision of corporate greatness. And I took a moment to appreciate the irony that I was walking across his precious marble to take control of his precious company. The conference room doors were already open, and I could see them all sitting there around that massive table that probably cost more than most people's cars, looking like students waiting for the principal to arrive and deliver bad news about their test scores or behavior reports. Gerald sat at the far end of the table, as far away from the door as physically possible, pale and sweating despite the aggressive air conditioning that kept the room at a temperature somewhere between uncomfortably cold and commercial refrigerator. His suit was different from the one he'd ruined in the rain at my house, but he wore it with none of his usual confidence, slumped in his chair like someone had removed his spine and forgotten to put it back. The other board members, those titans of industry who'd rubber-stamped every one of Gerald's idiotic ideas for years without bothering to ask basic questions like, "Is this legal?" or "Does this make any sense?" were suddenly experts in sitting very still and avoiding eye contact. They nodded respectfully as I walked in, some of them actually standing up like I was royalty or the president or someone who deserved that level of deference, which I absolutely did after everything they'd put me through by enabling Gerald's incompetence. I took my seat at the head of the table, the spot where Gerald usually sat when he was running these meetings, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel incredibly good to watch him sit there at the opposite end, displaced, defeated, looking like a man who'd just realized that everything he thought he knew about his life was actually built on foundations he'd never bothered to inspect. I opened my laptop, the same one I'd shown him the founder's documents on just days ago, and pulled up Atlas, which now recognized me as the primary administrator again and displayed all its beautiful data across my screen in perfect, orderly rows. "Gentlemen," I said, and my voice was calm and professional and carried just enough authority to make it clear that we were doing things my way now. First order of business. We need to conduct a full forensic audit of every contract signed during Mr. Kale's tenure as CEO, particularly over the last 3 years when he decided that corporate governance was more of a suggestion than a requirement. We need to examine every major decision, every financial transaction, every vendor relationship, and every consulting agreement to ensure that everything was above board and in the company's best interests. I pressed a button on my laptop and Atlas sprang to life on the conference room's main display screen, that enormous monitor that took up most of the wall and usually showed PowerPoint presentations full of rocket ships and motivational quotes. Instead of Gerald's usual slideshow of nonsense, Atlas projected graphs, spreadsheets, data visualizations, shell accounts that I'd flagged weeks ago, fake consultancy payments to companies that didn't seem to exist, wire transfers to offshore accounts that had no clear business purpose. All of it laid out in beautiful, damning detail faster than Gerald could blink or formulate a defense or do anything except sit there and watch his sins displayed in high definition for everyone to see. The room went silent. That particular kind of silence that happens when people are seeing something they can't unsee, when the truth becomes so obvious that denial is no longer an option. I watched their faces as they processed the information, watched several board members lean forward to get a better look at the numbers, watched one of them actually gasp when he saw the total amount of money that had been funneled through questionable channels, watched Gerald sink lower in his chair like he was trying to disappear into the leather upholstery. As you can see, I continued, my voice still perfectly level, still professional, but with an edge that suggested I was enjoying this more than was probably appropriate for a serious business meeting. There are some significant irregularities that need to be addressed. Consulting fees paid to companies that share addresses with personal properties owned by Mr. Kale's friends. Vendor contracts awarded without proper bidding processes to companies that seem to have no employees or infrastructure. Wire transfers labeled as operational expenses that went to accounts in the Cayman Islands and then promptly disappeared into the financial ether. I didn't need to raise my voice, didn't need to dramatically point fingers or make accusations like some kind of courtroom lawyer in a TV drama. I just let Atlas do the talking, let the data speak for itself, let the numbers and the transactions and the patterns tell the story that was so obvious once you actually bothered to look at it instead of accepting Gerald's explanations at face value. The company he'd claimed to be steering toward greatness, his precious rocket ship, had actually been fueling a few private jets for his friends, financing their lifestyles, paying for God knows what while he stood in front of investors and talked about synergy and disruption and all those other buzzwords that meant absolutely nothing. One of the board members, Thompson, I think his name was, an older guy who'd been with the company since Gerald's father was still alive and probably should have spoken up years ago, but had been too comfortable collecting his board member fees to rock the boat, cleared his throat and asked in a shaky voice, "How long has this been going on? How much are we talking about total?" I pulled up another screen, this one showing a timeline that stretched back nearly 5 years, with the frequency and amounts of suspicious transactions increasing dramatically over the last 18 months as Gerald had apparently gotten more confident that nobody was paying attention or that he was too important to question. Conservatively, I said, letting that word hang in the air for a moment. We're looking at somewhere between $47 and $63 million in questionable transactions, possibly more depending on what the forensic accountants find when they dig deeper into the offshore accounts and shell companies. That's not pocket change, gentlemen. That's not a rounding error. That's systematic fraud that's been happening right under your noses while you all nodded along and approved budgets without reading them. Gerald finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and desperate, nothing like his usual confident CEO tone that he used when he was bullshitting his way through investor calls. This is taken out of context. Those were legitimate business expenses. Those consulting companies provided valuable services. You can't just throw around accusations like this without understanding the full picture. I turned to look at him, really look at him, and felt absolutely nothing except maybe a vague sense of pity for someone so delusional that even with the evidence literally projected on a wall in front of him, he still thought he could talk his way out of it. Then explain it to us, Gerald. Explain why you paid $3 million to a consulting company that's registered at your golf buddy's lake house. Explain why you approved bonuses for executives who didn't meet their performance targets while cutting benefits for frontline employees who actually did the work. Explain why you fired your chief systems architect without a proper board vote, violating both corporate governance procedures and your own father's explicit instructions about succession planning. He had no explanation, at least not one that made any sense or would hold up to any kind of scrutiny, and we all knew it. The board members were looking at each other now, having silent conversations with their eyes, the kind of nonverbal communication that happens when people are trying to figure out how to distance themselves from a disaster without looking like they'd been complicit in it, even though they absolutely had been through their negligence and their willingness to let Gerald do whatever he wanted as long as the stock price was going up. I closed my laptop with a gentle click that somehow felt more final than if I'd slammed it shut, and leaned back in my chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd just won a game they'd been playing for 17 years. I think we all know what needs to happen here. The question is whether we do it cleanly and professionally, or whether we drag this out, and let the media and the prosecutors have a field day with all of this. Your choice, gentlemen, but I'd recommend the former because the latter is going to be extremely expensive and extremely public, and I don't think any of us want that. Within a week, and I'm talking about 7 calendar days that probably felt like 7 years to Gerald as he watched his empire crumble around him in slow motion, like a building being demolished floor by floor, the board voted him out for cause. Not a resignation, not a mutual parting of ways, not one of those gentle pursuing other opportunities press releases that companies put out when they want to pretend a firing was actually a friendly decision made by adults who respect each other. No, this was a full, official, documented in the corporate records termination for cause, complete with findings of financial impropriety, violation of fiduciary duty, breach of corporate governance procedures, and basically every other corporate law violation short of actual criminal charges. Though honestly those might be coming too, depending on what the forensic accountants found when they really dug into those offshore accounts. The vote was unanimous, which would have been funny if it wasn't so predictable. Watching all those board members who'd spent years enabling Gerald's worst impulses suddenly trip over themselves to distance themselves from him like he developed a contagious disease. They voted to remove him, voted to approve the forensic audit, voted to cooperate fully with any regulatory investigations, voted to implement new oversight procedures, voted on basically everything I suggested because they were terrified that if they didn't, they'd be next on the chopping block. And honestly, they weren't wrong to be scared because some of them absolutely deserved to lose their cushy board positions for their years of negligent rubber stamping. There was no golden parachute, no massive severance package, no 7-figure payout for his years of service that would let him retire comfortably to some private island where disgraced CEOs go to write books about leadership and give TED Talks about resilience. The founders' documents and the corporate bylaws were very clear about what happened when a CEO was terminated for cause. They got exactly what their employment contracts specified for misconduct, which in Gerald's case was basically nothing except whatever he'd already earned up to the termination date. And even that was being held pending the results of the investigation because there was a very real possibility he'd have to pay some of it back if they found evidence of actual theft rather than just spectacularly bad judgment. There was no handshake, no farewell party, no gathering of employees to thank him for his years of service and wish him well in his future endeavors. Just a slow, painful, utterly humiliating walk to the elevator on a Thursday afternoon while the company he once ruled, the kingdom he thought he'd inherited by divine right just for being his father's son, moved on without him like he'd never existed. I wasn't there to watch it personally because I had actual work to do, actual problems to solve, actual messes to clean up that Gerald had left behind. But Leo sent me a video that someone had surreptitiously recorded on their phone, shaky footage of Gerald carrying a small cardboard box, the universal symbol of corporate defeat. While employees who used to laugh at his jokes and applaud his presentations suddenly became very interested in their computer screens and pretended not to notice him. Walking by, the box probably contained some personal items from his office, maybe some photos of his family back when they still liked him, maybe some awards and plaques celebrating achievements that now seemed hollow and meaningless. Maybe that stupid motivational poster about rocket ships that had been hanging behind his desk for years. Whatever was in that box, it represented 17 years of accumulated corporate presence being reduced to something you could carry with one hand. And there was something profoundly sad about it, even though Gerald absolutely deserved every ounce of humiliation he was experiencing. Melissa filed for divorce shortly after. Not immediately because I think she needed a few days to process what had happened and maybe secretly hoped that somehow this was all a bad dream or a misunderstanding that could be fixed with enough lawyers and family meetings. But once it became clear that Gerald wasn't coming back, that his reputation was destroyed, that the family legacy her grandfather had built was now in the hands of the son-in-law who'd orchestrated her father's downfall, she made her decision. She hired one of those aggressive divorce attorneys who specialize in high-net-worth cases, the kind who send letters with phrases like irreconcilable differences and division of marital assets, and make everything sound clinical and businesslike instead of emotional and messy, even though emotions and mess were exactly what our marriage had become. I got served with papers at the office, which felt appropriately dramatic, a guy in a cheap suit walking into my new corner office that used to be Gerald's office and handing me an envelope, while saying Adrian Holt, like there was any doubt about who I was sitting in the CEO's chair. I told her, and I tried to keep my voice gentle even though I was exhausted from 16-hour days trying to fix the mess Gerald had left behind. Technically, your family destroyed themselves. I just provided the PowerPoint presentation that made it obvious to everyone else what had been happening for years. Your father violated corporate law, Melissa. He stole from the company. He fired me illegally because his ego couldn't handle being told he was wrong. None of that is my fault. I didn't make him do those things. I just refused to cover for him anymore. She didn't laugh, but I did, not because it was funny, but because sometimes when things get absurd enough, when the gap between how someone sees reality and what reality actually is becomes too wide to bridge with words, laughter is the only response that makes sense. She hung up on me before I could say anything else, and I sat there in my office, in Gerald's old office with his old view of the city that was now my view, and felt the weight of everything that had happened settle on my shoulders like a heavy coat I couldn't take off. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly quick and relatively painless as far as divorces go, probably because neither of us wanted to drag it out and make it worse than it already was. Probably because Melissa wanted to get as far away from me as possible and start rebuilding her life away from the wreckage of her father's career. Probably because both of our lawyers were competent professionals who understood that fighting over every piece of furniture and every shared asset would just make everyone miserable and burn through money that could be better spent on therapy or moving expenses or literally anything else. We split our assets according to the prenuptial agreement that her father had ironically insisted we sign before we got married, back when he was worried that I might divorce his daughter and take half her trust fund, never imagining that the prenup would actually protect me when she divorced me for taking down her father's corrupt empire. She got the house that her father had helped us buy, which felt appropriate since it had always felt more like his house than ours anyway, filled with furniture and art and expensive things that he'd chosen or approved of. I got my freedom, my professional reputation restored, and control of a company that I actually understood how to run, which seemed like a fair trade even if it meant sleeping in a service department for a few months while I figured out my personal life. Sometimes karma doesn't need a hammer, doesn't need dramatic confrontations or violent revenge or any of the theatrical justice that people fantasize about when they've been wronged. Sometimes karma just needs good code, solid planning, and the patience to let people create their own consequences through their own actions. Gerald had built the trap himself with years of bad decisions and illegal behavior, and I'd just been the person who pointed out that the trap existed and maybe everyone should be concerned about that before it was too late. Except it was already too late, had been too late probably years ago, and all I'd done was make the inevitable happen a little faster and a little more publicly than it might have otherwise. The media had a field day with the story, of course, because disgraced CEOs are basically catnip for business journalists who spend most of their time writing boring articles about quarterly earnings and market trends. Energy giant CEO ousted in corporate coup, read one headline, which wasn't exactly accurate since it was less a coup and more a legally mandated consequence of his own actions. But accuracy has never been journalism's strong suit when they can go with something more dramatic. Son-in-law takes down father-in-law's empire, read another. Accompanied by unflattering photos of both of us that they'd clearly chosen specifically to make us look as sketchy as possible. Gerald looking red-faced and angry in some shareholder meeting. Me looking too serious and vaguely sinister in my employee ID photo. There were think pieces about corporate governance, about the dangers of family businesses and nepotism, about the importance of checks and balances and independent boards, about everything except the simple truth that Gerald had been a mediocre executive who'd inherited a company his father built and had slowly destroyed it through a combination of ego, incompetence, and outright theft. But the media loved the David versus Goliath narrative, loved the idea of the overlooked tech genius bringing down the powerful CEO, loved the irony of the son-in-law using the father-in-law's own father's legal documents to take control. So I let them tell whatever story they wanted because the truth was documented in court filings and corporate records for anyone who actually cared to look. Within 3 weeks of Gerald's departure, the company's stock had stabilized and actually started recovering as investors realized that the leadership change might actually be good for business, that having someone who understood how the company actually worked might be preferable to having someone who just looked good in suits and gave inspiring speeches. Atlas was running smoothly again. All the frozen transactions had been processed, payroll had gone through without a hitch, vendors had been paid, and the existential crisis that had gripped the company for those chaotic few days had passed like a fever breaking. I spent my evenings alone in my temporary apartment, eating takeout and reading through years of corporate documents that Gerald had never bothered to understand, finding more problems that needed fixing, more decisions that needed reversing, more messes that needed cleaning up. It wasn't glamorous work, wasn't the exciting revenge fantasy that people probably imagined. It was just the slow, tedious process of rebuilding systems and restoring trust and making sure that the company Gerald's father had founded would survive Gerald's attempt to destroy it through negligence and greed. My first day as CEO, officially as CEO with business cards and an email signature that said Chief Executive Officer instead of Lead Systems Architect, felt poetic in a way that I hadn't quite anticipated when I was planning all of this from my study at 2 in the morning with my encrypted tablet and my fancy tea. It was one of those crystalline autumn mornings where the air feels sharp and clean, where the sunlight hits the buildings at just the right angle to make the whole city look like it's been dipped in gold, where everything feels possible and new even though most of what I was doing was actually very old, just returning things to the way they should have been all along before Gerald spent years screwing them up. I arrived early, before most of the employees, before the morning rush of people flooding into the lobby with their coffee cups and their Monday morning expressions, before the elevators filled up with small talk and awkward silences. I wanted to experience this moment alone, wanted to walk through the building without an audience, wanted to feel what it was like to be the person responsible for all of this, for the thousands of employees whose paychecks depended on my decisions, for the shareholders who were cautiously optimistic that maybe this disaster could be turned into something resembling success, for the legacy of Gerald's father who'd built something meaningful and deserved better than watching his son run it into the ground. The same office, Gerald's old corner office that was now my corner office, felt different somehow, even though nothing had physically changed except the name plate outside the door and the fact that I'd had them remove all of Gerald's motivational posters and replace them with exactly nothing because blank walls felt more honest than fake inspiration. The same massive desk made of some endangered wood that probably shouldn't have been made into furniture, the same ergonomic chair that cost more than most people's monthly rent, the same view of the skyline that stretched out for miles in every direction, tall buildings and cranes and construction sites, and the endless busy chaos of a city that never stopped moving or building or destroying and rebuilding itself. But this time, sitting in that chair, looking at that view, I wasn't the fired employee being escorted out by security guards who couldn't make eye contact. I wasn't the paranoid anchor whose reports got thrown in the trash like junk mail. I wasn't the son-in-law who was tolerated because he was married to the boss's daughter and was good with computers, but wasn't really important to the actual business of business. I was the CEO, the person at the top of the organizational chart, the one whose decisions would ripple down through every department and affect every person who worked here, and nobody, absolutely nobody, dared call me an anchor anymore because they'd all seen what happened to the last person who'd underestimated me. Only this time, I wasn't there to prove a point or settle a score or show everyone how smart I was. I was there to actually do the job, to fix the problems, to build something that would last beyond my ego or Gerald's ego or anyone else's ego. The revenge part was over, had been satisfying while it lasted, but was ultimately just the opening act. Now came the hard part, the part that didn't make for good dramatic stories or sensational headlines, the part where I had to actually prove that I wasn't just good at tearing things down, but could also build them back up. One of my first official acts as CEO, and I'd been planning this particular move since before I even activated the Covenant Protocol, because symbolism matters even in business, was to rename the main conference room. The one where Gerald had thrown away my report, where he'd called me paranoid, where the board had enabled his worst impulses for years, where I'd eventually returned to show them all the evidence of his fraud. That room needed a new identity, needed to represent what the company should be rather than what it had become under Gerald's leadership. I renamed it the Founder's Room, a tribute to Gerald's father who'd understood that businesses need integrity more than they need charisma, who'd built protections into his corporate documents because he knew that good intentions weren't enough without good systems to enforce them, who'd trusted me enough to include provisions that would eventually save the company from his own son's incompetence. I installed a bronze plaque outside the door, commissioned from a local artist who specialized in this kind of thing, engraved with words that I'd spent an embarrassing amount of time perfecting because I wanted them to mean something real rather than just being another corporate platitude that people would read once and then ignore forever. The plaque read, "Integrity is the only fuel that keeps a rocket in orbit." It was a deliberate callback to Gerald's favorite metaphor, the rocket ship he'd talked about constantly, the grand vision of launching the company into space or success or whatever destination he'd imagined in his motivational slideshow fantasies. But where Gerald had focused on the launch, on the excitement and the spectacle and the inspiring imagery of rockets blasting off toward the stars, he'd completely missed the point that rockets need constant fuel to stay in orbit, that maintaining altitude is harder than achieving it, that integrity isn't something you can fake or shortcut or replace with buzzwords and enthusiasm. The plaque was unveiled on a Friday afternoon, nothing fancy or ceremonial, just me and a small group of employees who'd been with the company long enough to remember when Gerald's father was alive and to appreciate what the gesture meant. A few of them got emotional, which I hadn't expected but probably should have. Older workers who'd seen the company change over the years and had worried that the founder's values had been lost somewhere along the way. One guy, must have been in his 60s, came up to me after and shook my hand with both of his, looked me in the eye with the kind of intensity that suggested he was trying not to cry, and said, "Thank you for bringing us back." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and hoped it was enough. Then, after the small crowd dispersed and went back to their desks and their work and their regular Friday afternoon countdown to the weekend, I did something I hadn't done in years, something I'd been too busy or too stressed or too focused on survival to do. I went back to my office, closed the door, sat down at my desk, pulled out my old briefcase that I'd carried for 17 years through every meeting and every crisis and every small victory, and I brewed my tea. Not office kitchen tea, not the sad tea bags that taste like paper and regret, but my actual good tea, the Darjeeling silver leaf that I'd started bringing from home, because some things are too important to compromise on even in the middle of corporate warfare. The electric kettle I'd brought and sat on the credenza, completely out of place among the expensive office furniture and the serious business equipment. But I didn't care because this was my office now, and if I wanted to brew tea like a civilized human being instead of drinking the burned coffee that most executives seem to survive on, that was my prerogative as CEO. The water heated, the tea steeped, and I poured myself a cup in the same mug I'd been using for years, slightly chipped around the rim from that time I dropped it in the parking lot, but still functional, still mine, still a reminder that you don't need expensive things to have meaningful experiences. I sat there with my tea, the steam rising in delicate spirals, and whispered to the empty office, to Atlas somewhere in the digital infrastructure humming away in the server rooms, to myself, and to whatever part of Gerald's father's spirit might still be hanging around, making sure his company survived his son's best efforts to destroy it. Well, Atlas, we're back. It felt dramatic and probably a little silly, talking to an AI system like it was a person, like it could hear me or care about my philosophical musings. But after everything we'd been through together, after Atlas had executed the Covenant protocol perfectly and helped expose Gerald's fraud and basically save the company, it felt right to acknowledge the partnership even if I was the only conscious being in the conversation. The screens on my desk lit up in response, not because Atlas had somehow achieved sentience and was responding to my greeting, but because I'd scheduled a system diagnostic to run at this exact time, and it was displaying the results across my monitors. Data flowing perfectly, every system running at optimal efficiency, every department connected and communicating and functioning like a healthy organism instead of the diseased mess it had been a few weeks ago when Gerald's firing had triggered the lockdown. Green indicators everywhere I looked, confirmation that everything was working exactly as designed, that the crisis was over and we could finally focus on actually running a business instead of just surviving. Outside my window, the city glittered in the late afternoon sun, thousands of windows reflecting light, thousands of people in thousands of offices doing their own work and fighting their own battles, and probably never knowing or caring about the corporate drama that had consumed my life for the past few weeks. The buildings reached toward the sky like they were competing to see who could get closest to the clouds. Cranes swinging across construction sites where tomorrow's skyscrapers were being built by people who showed up every day and did the actual work while executives took credit and made speeches. It was beautiful in that impersonal way that cities are beautiful. All that human ambition and effort and struggle compressed into steel and glass and concrete. All those individual stories invisible from up here on the 48th floor. Inside, in my office with my tea and my monitors displaying Atlas's perfect diagnostics, I smiled, not the sarcastic smile I'd been wearing for weeks while watching Gerald's empire crumble, not the satisfied smirk of successful revenge, but something quieter and more genuine, the kind of smile that comes from actually accomplishing something difficult and meaningful. The smile of someone who'd spent 17 years building something important, had watched it almost get destroyed by incompetence and greed, and had somehow managed to save it while also holding people accountable for their actions. They had called me an anchor, had dismissed me as the paranoid tech guy who worried too much and didn't understand the bigger picture, had treated me like I was holding them back from their rocket ship dreams of corporate glory and unlimited growth. But it turned out, and this was the part that still made me laugh when I thought about it too long, it turned out that I wasn't the anchor at all. Anchors hold things down, keep them stuck in one place, prevent movement and progress. What I actually was, what I'd always been even when nobody recognized it or appreciated it, was the engine, the thing that actually made everything work. The component that you can't see from the outside but without which nothing else functions. Gerald had wanted a rocket ship, had loved the metaphor so much that he'd put it on posters and presentations and probably would have painted it on the side of the building if the board had let him. But rocket ships are complicated machines, not inspirational concepts. They need engineers who understand physics and fuel consumption and orbital mechanics, not CEOs who give motivational speeches about reaching for the stars. They need people who can do the actual work of keeping systems running, who can spot problems before they become disasters, who can build things that last beyond the initial excitement of the launch. And now, sitting in the CEO's chair with my tea and my monitors, and my renamed conference room with its bronze plaque about integrity, I had the chance to prove that the metaphor could actually work if you had the right person running it. Not someone who talked about rocket ships, but someone who actually understood how to build them and fly them, and keep them in orbit year after year through good times and bad. Tomorrow was going to bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new crises to manage, because that's what running a company means regardless of whether you're doing it well or doing it poorly. There would be difficult decisions about personnel and strategy, uncomfortable conversations about the employees who'd enabled Gerald's behavior and whether they deserved second chances, complex negotiations with regulators who wanted to make sure this kind of fraud didn't happen again. Media interviews where I'd have to talk about corporate governance and accountability without sounding too self-righteous or too bitter about what had happened. But tonight, for this one perfect moment at the end of my first official day as CEO, I just sat in my office and drank my tea and watched the city lights start to come on as the sun set behind the buildings, and I let myself feel satisfied. Not with the revenge, not with taking down Gerald, not with any of that petty personal victory stuff that had motivated me in the beginning. Satisfied with having saved something worth saving. Satisfied with having proven that integrity actually matters, that systems and processes and doing things the right way actually produces better results than charisma and buzzwords and motivational posters. Satisfied with having turned the founder's vision, Gerald's father's original dream of building something meaningful and lasting, back into reality after watching it get corrupted and degraded for years. That felt like an accomplishment worth having, worth all the stress and the dissolved marriage and the uncomfortable conversations and the late nights and the risk of complete failure if the covenant protocol hadn't worked exactly as planned. My phone buzzed with another notification, probably Leo sending me some meme about corporate comebacks or another update about the company's recovering stock price, but I ignored it. Tomorrow I'd be back to responding to every message and managing every crisis and being the responsible CEO who kept everything running smoothly. But tonight, just for tonight, I was going to finish my tea, watch the sunset, and appreciate the fact that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys win. They'd call me an anchor. Fair enough. But anchors don't just hold things down. They also keep ships from drifting into rocks and sinking to the bottom of the ocean. And it turns out that what this company had actually needed all along wasn't someone to launch it into space, but someone to keep it steady and stable and pointed in the right direction. Someone who understood that real success isn't about how high you fly. It's about whether you can sustain that altitude without crashing. Gerald had wanted to be the pilot of a rocket ship. I was content being the engineer who made sure the engines actually worked. And in the end, that made all the difference. After my cheating wife left me and destroyed my business, I drove Uber to survive. One passenger, a dying old man, said, "You remind me of someone I lost." He tipped $30,000 and left his card. The next day, his lawyer called. "He died last night, but changed his will because of you." The inheritance was $89 million. But the lawyer's next sentence, "The reason the old man chose me made me cry." Look, I'm not saying I hit rock bottom. I'm saying rock bottom hit me first, then charged me interest. If desperation had a signature scent, it would be a toxic blend of 3-day-old McDonald's fries fossilizing under the passenger seat, mixed with that god-awful new car smell, air freshener dangling from my rearview mirror like a little tree of lies. That's what my 2015 Honda Civic smelled like these days, and honestly, it was a pretty accurate representation of my entire existence after Miranda decided to take a wrecking ball to our life together. We'd built Greendale landscapes from the ground up, and when I say we, I mean I broke my back doing actual landscaping work while she schmoozed clients over overpriced lattes and talked about synergy like it was a real thing normal humans cared about. She was the face, I was the hands, knees, and occasionally the guy who got poison ivy in places I'm not comfortable discussing. For 5 years, it worked. We were a team. We were partners. We were also, apparently, a tragic setup for the world's most predictable country song, because she didn't just leave me. She left me for my business partner, Doug. Yeah, Doug. The same Doug who wore cargo shorts to client meetings and thought business casual meant tucking in his Metallica t-shirt. She handled clients, all right. She handled Doug too. Literally. In our office. On the desk where we used to plan our futures and eat sad desk lunches together. When I found out, I didn't even get to do the whole dramatic confrontation thing, because by the time I pieced it together, she'd already consulted with a lawyer, frozen our joint accounts, and somehow convinced our actual clients that I was the toxic one holding the business back. Within 6 months, I lost the house, the one with the garden I'd personally designed, which felt like the universe had a real sick sense of irony. I lost the company I'd built with my own bleeding hands. I lost the marriage I thought was solid enough to weather anything except, apparently, Doug's persistent texting and his dumb beard. Oh, and the dog. Let's talk about the dog. Even Biscuit, our golden retriever who I'd rescued from a shelter and loved like a child, ran away 2 weeks after Miranda moved out. I'm not kidding when I say that dog looked guilty when I came home one day and found the back gate open. There were muddy paw prints leading away from the yard like some kind of canine prison break, and I swear to God, if dogs could leave notes, his would have said, "Sorry bro, but the vibes here are terrible and I'm out." I spent 3 days posting flyers, checking shelters, and calling his name in parks like a lunatic, but Biscuit had clearly decided that whatever life awaited him on the streets was preferable to watching me ugly cry in his cereal bowls at 2 in the morning. So yeah, I became an Uber driver. Me, Liam Henley, the guy who once had business cards with embossed lettering and a website that didn't look like it was designed in 1997, was now driving strangers around Minneapolis while they ignored me and argued with their significant others on speakerphone. I had a PhD in bad luck and a minor in humiliation, and my office was now a Honda that smelled like regret and processed potatoes. My mornings started at 5:30 a.m., which is an ungodly hour that should be illegal in all 50 states. I'd park in the back corner of the Walmart parking lot on Lyndale Avenue, strategically positioning myself near the cart return so I could pretend I was there for a reason other than abject despair. I'd sip cold gas station coffee from a cracked thermos, because apparently, I couldn't even afford the luxury of hot beverages anymore, and I'd stare at my phone, watching the little Uber requests pop up like tiny reminders that this was my life now. Sometimes I'd tell myself I was on a journey of self-discovery, which is what people say when they're too proud to admit they're just broke, exhausted, and one broken windshield wiper away from a complete psychological meltdown. The reality was simpler and significantly less Instagram-worthy. I was surviving, barely, one $5 ride at a time. I'd pick up nurses heading to early shifts, college kids stumbling home from parties they'd remember fondly in 10 years, and business travelers who treated me like I was part of the car's upholstery. Most people didn't even look at me. I was invisible, a ghost in a Honda, a nameless driver in a city full of people too busy checking their phones to notice the guy behind the wheel used to have dreams bigger than make rent this month. But here's the thing about life, and I mean this in the most cosmically ridiculous way possible. It's got a twisted sense of humor. Just when you think you've perfected the art of being invisible, just when you've resigned yourself to being that background character in everyone else's story, fate decides to tap you on the shoulder. And sometimes, fate wears a cashmere coat that probably costs more than your car's blue book value. I didn't know it that morning, sitting in that Walmart parking lot with my cold coffee and my wounded pride, but my life was about to get weird. Not good weird or bad weird, just profoundly, inexplicably, life-alteringly weird. The kind of weird that makes you question whether you're living in reality or if you've accidentally stumbled into some indie film where the universe is the director and apparently thinks plot twists are hilarious. My phone buzzed at 5:47 a.m. airport pickup. Terminal C to downtown Grandview Hotel. Fair estimate, $23. I accepted it because that's what you do when your checking account has 2 digits and one of them is a 0. I pulled out of that Walmart parking lot, windshield wipers squeaking against the drizzle that had started falling like the sky itself was depressed, and I drove toward the airport with absolutely no idea that I was about to meet a man who would change everything. But that's how the best stories start, isn't it? With cold coffee, a broken heart, and absolutely no clue that everything you thought you knew about your life was about to get turned upside down by an 80-something-year-old man who smelled like expensive cologne and looked at you like he'd been waiting his whole life to find you in the back of a Walmart parking lot at dawn. The rain that morning felt personal, like God had specifically selected my Honda out of every vehicle in Minneapolis and decided, yeah, that guy needs a little extra misery today. It wasn't the romantic movie kind of rain either. You know, the kind where beautiful people run through it while indie music plays and everything looks artistically melancholic. No, this was that spiteful, cold, gets into your bones kind of rain that makes you question every life decision that led you to being outside at 6 in the morning. The kind of rain that says, you thought yesterday was bad? Hold my beer. I pulled up to Terminal C at Minneapolis-St. Paul International, my windshield wipers doing that annoying thing where they screech like they're personally offended by moisture. The arrivals area was mostly empty except for a few exhausted-looking travelers dragging suitcases that had clearly been through more than one battle with airline baggage handlers. My phone showed the passenger's name, Vernon C. Pickup location marked. I scanned the curb, looking for someone who matched the generic profile picture in the app, which, let's be honest, could have been anyone from a college student to somebody's grandfather. Then I saw him, and I immediately knew this wasn't going to be a typical ride where I'd spend 20 minutes in silence while someone scrolled through TikTok in my back seat. Mr. Vernon Claiborne looked like he'd walked straight out of a Ralph Lauren catalog, circa 1985, except instead of modeling sweaters on a yacht, he was standing under the airport overhang, looking like money incarnate. We're talking 80-something years old, maybe older, the kind of age where you've stopped counting because numbers become irrelevant when you've got that much life experience etched into your face. He wore a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than I'd made in the last 3 months, a silk scarf that looked smoother than my entire existence, and shoes so polished I could see my reflection in them from 15 feet away. His hair was silver, perfectly combed, and he carried a leather briefcase that screamed, "I've closed deals that changed industries." He moved slowly, deliberately, like every step was calculated and measured. But when he spoke, his voice was sharp, cutting through the rain and the airport chaos like a knife through warm butter. "You're Liam?" he asked, already knowing the answer because my beat-up Honda with the Uber sticker was kind of a dead giveaway. "That's me," I said, popping the trunk. "Let me grab your bag, sir." "I've got it," he said, but not in a dismissive way. More like a man who'd spent his whole life refusing help because accepting it felt like admitting weakness. He placed his bag in the trunk with a precision that suggested he'd done this exact motion 10,000 times in his life, then settled into the back seat with a small grunt that old knees make when they're forced to bend at unnatural angles. I pulled away from the curb, merging into the light morning traffic heading downtown. The rain picked up, because of course it did. My wipers protested louder. The car smelled like old fries and now, faintly, like expensive cologne that probably had a French name I couldn't pronounce. Rough weather, I said, because that's what you say when you're an Uber driver and the silence feels too heavy. Weather talk, the universal language of people who don't know each other but are temporarily stuck together in a moving vehicle. He smiled, not the polite, dismissive smile people give service workers, but a real one, like I'd said something that actually registered in his brain. I've seen worse, he replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd lived through things that made a little rain look like a minor inconvenience. Try negotiating hostile corporate takeovers in the 80s during a thunderstorm when your competition is trying to literally steal your company out from under you. That's rough weather. I laughed because, honestly, what else are you supposed to do when an elderly businessman casually drops a line like that? Well, sir, the roughest weather I've dealt with lately is my ex-wife's lawyer, so I think you've still got me beat. He chuckled, a dry sound that suggested he'd heard every variation of divorce jokes humanity had to offer. Divorce, huh? Expensive business, that. You have no idea, I said, shaking my head as I merged onto I-35. Or maybe you do. You look like a man who's been through some things. Several things, he said, his tone shifting slightly, like we'd stumbled onto territory he didn't usually discuss with strangers. Most of them expensive in ways that have nothing to do with money. We drove in silence for a while after that, and it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people are both thinking about their respective disasters, but don't quite know how to articulate them. The rain drummed on the roof. The highway stretched ahead, gray and endless. My GPS cheerfully informed me we'd arrive at the Grandview Hotel in 17 minutes, as if time meant anything when you're trapped in existential contemplation with a stranger who smells like he's worth millions. Then he broke the silence with a question that caught me completely off guard. What did you do before this? I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. His eyes were sharp, intensely focused, like he wasn't just making small talk, but genuinely wanted to know. You mean before I became Minneapolis's most average Uber driver? Yes, before that. I sighed, because the answer required explaining a level of failure I usually tried to avoid discussing before 7 a.m. I owned a landscaping company. Built it from nothing. Well, built it with my wife, technically. Greendale Landscapes. We had 30 employees, contracts with some of the biggest properties in the Twin Cities, even did work for a few commercial developments. I was good at it too. Really good. Had this whole vision about sustainable urban landscaping, native plant integration, the whole environmentally conscious thing before it was trendy. Impressive, Vernon said, and he sounded like he meant it. Was impressive, I corrected. Past tense. Then my wife decided that our business partner Doug was more interesting than me, and apparently, sleeping with him meant she also got to sleep with my half of the company. She turned every client against me, convinced them I was difficult to work with, and by the time the lawyers finished bleeding me dry, I had nothing. No company, no house, no wife, and somehow, no dog either, because even Biscuit decided I was too depressing to be around. Vernon was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then he said something I didn't expect. So you're a survivor. I'm a guy driving strangers around in a car that smells like defeat, I said. Not sure that qualifies as surviving. It does, he said firmly. Survival isn't about winning. It's about still being here when everything's told you to quit. Trust me, I've watched empires crumble, including my own a few times. The people who survive aren't the smartest or the richest. They're the ones too stubborn to disappear. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just kept driving, feeling like this random elderly passenger had somehow looked directly into my soul and decided to give it a pep talk. We talked more after that, about failure, ambition, business, and how the only thing faster than success is how quickly people vanish when you lose everything. He told me about building his pharmaceutical company in the 70s, about competitors who tried to destroy him, about regulatory battles and patent wars that sounded like something out of a corporate thriller novel. He spoke with the casual authority of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of people. When he asked about my family, I gave him the short version. Just me and the Honda now. My dad and I barely talk. We had a falling out years ago over something stupid that became something big. My mom passed when I was in college. No siblings. So yeah, it's pretty much just me and whatever classic rock station is playing at any given moment. He went quiet again, staring out the window at the rain-soaked city rolling past. Then, so softly I almost didn't hear it, he said, "You remind me of someone I lost." And just like that, the energy in the car shifted from casual conversation to something heavier, something that felt like grief dressed up in expensive clothing. The thing about driving strangers around for a living is that you become accustomed to a certain level of emotional detachment. People get in your car, they exist in your space for 15 minutes or an hour. They share fragments of their lives, complaints about their boss, excitement about a date, anxiety about a job interview, and then they disappear forever. You're like a mobile confessional booth, except instead of forgiving sins, you're just trying to maintain a 5-star rating and avoid getting 1-starred because someone didn't like your choice of air freshener. You learn not to get attached. You learn not to ask follow-up questions. You definitely learn not to let their stories creep under your skin and set up permanent residence in your brain. But Vernon Claiborne wasn't playing by those rules, and honestly, neither was I at this point. When he said I reminded him of someone he'd lost, the air in my Honda changed. It got heavier, thicker, like the rain outside had somehow seeped into the car and was pressing down on both of us. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, and his expression had shifted from that sharp, calculated businessman look to something more vulnerable, more human. His eyes were distant, staring at something only he could see, probably a memory that had been haunting him for longer than I'd been alive. I should have just nodded politely and changed the subject to something safe, like the Twins' chances this season or whether downtown traffic was always this terrible. That's what a professional Uber driver does. But something about this man made me break protocol, made me actually care about the answer. "Someone you lost?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone, one of those newer iPhones that looked pristine and probably had never seen a cracked screen in its life. His fingers moved slowly across the screen, the way older people navigate technology, with careful deliberation like they're defusing a bomb instead of just scrolling through photos. Finally, he turned the phone toward me, angling it so I could see it in the rearview mirror without causing a traffic accident. The photo showed a young man, maybe late 20s or early 30s, standing in front of what looked like a modern office building. He had dark hair that was slightly too long, like he'd been meaning to get a haircut for weeks but kept forgetting. He wore a suit but had loosened his tie, and his smile was crooked, genuine, the kind of smile that suggested he'd just said something sarcastic right before someone snapped the picture. But it was his eyes that got me. They had this intensity to them, this fire that burned behind exhaustion, like he was running on determination and coffee and refusing to admit he was tired. "My son," Vernon said quietly, his voice carrying decades of grief compressed into 2 words. "Thomas. He died 15 years ago." Angry at me. I didn't know what to say to that. What are you supposed to say when someone casually drops a tragedy that massive into your lap while you're merging onto the highway in rush hour traffic? "I'm so sorry" felt inadequate, like bringing a water pistol to a 5-alarm fire. So, I just stayed quiet, letting him continue if he wanted to, which apparently he did. "We fought about business," Vernon continued, still staring at the photo like if he looked hard enough, his son might somehow climb out of the screen and back into existence. "Thomas wanted to expand the company faster, take bigger risks, break into international markets before we were ready. I wanted him to slow down, build a stronger foundation, wait for the right opportunities." Classic father-son disagreement. I thought I was protecting him from making mistakes I'd made. He thought I was holding him back from his potential. The rain was coming down harder now, and my wipers were working overtime, squeaking their protest with every pass. We were about 10 minutes from the Grandview Hotel, but it felt like we'd entered some kind of temporal bubble where normal rules didn't apply, and a complete stranger was about to tell me something that would fundamentally alter how I saw the world. He left the office that night after one of our arguments. The big one. The one where he said I'd never believed in him, that I'd rather see the company die than watch him succeed his own way. He'd been drinking at his desk, which he never did, but I'd pushed him that far. Vernon's voice cracked slightly, a hairline fracture in that otherwise composed exterior. He got in his car, drunk and furious, and he never made it home. Wrapped his BMW around a telephone pole on Highway 100. Died instantly, the police said, like that was supposed to be comforting. Jesus Christ. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles going white. This was heavy. Like, too heavy for 6:30 in the morning, too heavy for a random Uber ride. Too heavy for a guy like me who was barely holding his own life together with duct tape and denial. The last thing I ever said to him was that he wasn't ready to run a company. Vernon continued, and now I could hear the self-loathing in his voice, the kind that comes from 15 years of replaying the same conversation and wishing you could go back and say literally anything else. The last thing he said to me was that I'd regret underestimating him. And you know what? He was right. I've regretted it every single day since. The car felt too small suddenly, like the walls were closing in and taking all the oxygen with them. I wanted to say something profound, something that would ease even a fraction of this man's pain, but my brain was completely empty except for the sound of windshield wipers and the crushing weight of generational trauma being dumped on me by a stranger in a cashmere coat. Instead, what came out of my mouth was, at least he didn't have to sit in Minneapolis traffic. Silver lining. There was a beat of silence. One of those moments where you immediately regret everything you've ever said in your entire life and wonder if it's too late to eject yourself from your own vehicle. And then Vernon laughed. Actually laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a real, genuine, from-the-belly laugh that filled the car and seemed to crack open something that had been sealed shut for years. God, you sound just like him, Vernon said, wiping his eyes. Thomas would have said exactly that. Dark humor in the face of tragedy. Never knew when to be serious. I glanced at him again in the mirror, and he was smiling now, but it was one of those bittersweet smiles that contain multitudes, grief and love and regret and acceptance all mixed together in a way that made my chest hurt. You have his eyes, Vernon said, leaning forward slightly, studying me like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve. Same fire, same stubbornness, same look like the world's beaten you down, but you're too annoyed to stay down. It's uncanny, actually. For once in my sarcastic, deflection-heavy life, I had absolutely no comeback. No joke, no witty retort, nothing. I just nodded, swallowing hard against that lump in my throat that had appeared out of nowhere, the one that no amount of humor could dissolve. Because there was something about the way this old man was looking at me, like I mattered, like I was more than just the guy driving him from point A to point B. Like maybe the universe had put us in this car together for a reason bigger than a $23 fare. We were 3 blocks from the Grandview Hotel now, and I realized I didn't want this ride to end. Which was crazy, considering we'd just had possibly the most depressing conversation I'd had since my divorce was finalized. But there was something about Vernon, something about his grief that felt familiar in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Maybe it was because we were both carrying around losses that had fundamentally changed who we were. Maybe it was because we both understood what it felt like to have regrets so heavy they'd permanently altered your posture. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because some connections transcend logic and timing and the normal rules of how strangers are supposed to interact in the back seat of a Honda Civic at dawn. We were maybe 5 blocks from the Grandview Hotel when Vernon did something that completely derailed my understanding of how Uber rides were supposed to work. He leaned forward, tapped my shoulder gently, the kind of tap that suggested urgency without aggression, and said, "Pull over here, if you don't mind." I glanced around. We were on Hennepin Avenue, surrounded by a weird mix of upscale restaurants that charged $30 for avocado toast, and dive bars that looked like they'd been there since before I was born. The rain was still falling with the enthusiasm of a sky that had personal beef with the entire state of Minnesota, and pulling over here meant blocking a lane during what was rapidly becoming morning rush hour. Here? Sir, we're literally 5 minutes from your hotel. Are you feeling okay? Do you need me to? I'm fine, he interrupted, but his voice had that quality that older people get when they're absolutely not fine, but they've spent so many decades pretending to be fine that they've perfected the lie. Just pull over. Please. So I did. Because what else are you supposed to do when an 80-something-year-old man who just told you about his dead son asks you to pull over? I flipped on my hazard lights, which immediately made the car feel like a mobile emergency, and shifted into park. Behind us, someone honked. Because of course they did, because Minneapolis drivers are contractually obligated to express their frustration at any minor inconvenience. Vernon sat back in his seat, and for the first time since he'd gotten in my car, he looked old. Not just elderly, but genuinely old, like the weight of every year he'd lived had suddenly decided to collect all at once. The rain drummed on the roof with a rhythm that felt almost meditative, and he stared out the window at nothing in particular. Or maybe at everything all at once, the way people do when they're seeing their entire life play out in their mind, like some kind of greatest hits reel that's heavy on the regrets. My doctor gave me 3 weeks, he said suddenly, matter-of-factly, like he was informing me about the weather forecast or telling me his hotel checkout time. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Spread to my liver, my lungs, pretty much everywhere that matters. They offered me treatment, but at my age, treatment just means dragging out the inevitable while feeling like garbage. So I declined. I froze. My hands were still on the steering wheel even though we were parked, and I realized I was gripping it so hard my fingers had gone numb. 3 weeks. This man had 3 weeks left on Earth, and he was spending part of that time in my beat-up Honda that smelled like a fast food crime scene, telling a complete stranger about his impending death. "Sir," I said, and my voice came out weird, strangled. "Are you, sure you want to be talking to me about this and not, say, your family? Or a priest? Or literally anyone else who's more qualified to handle existential conversations about mortality?" He chuckled, which seemed like an inappropriate response to being told someone was dying. But then again, what's the appropriate response? "My family's gone," he said simply. "Wife died 8 years ago from Alzheimer's. Spent the last 3 years not knowing who I was, which felt like a punishment custom designed for my specific sins. Thomas was our only child. No grandchildren, no nieces or nephews close enough to bother with. Just me and a company full of people who respect me professionally, but wouldn't recognize me if they saw me outside the boardroom." The honesty was brutal, the kind that hits you in the chest and makes it hard to breathe. Here was a man who'd clearly built an empire, who wore shoes that cost more than my monthly rent, who'd spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of people, and he was dying alone, confessing to his Uber driver because there was literally nobody else. "But maybe," Vernon continued, turning to look at me directly now, his eyes sharp despite the grief pooling in them. "Maybe I was meant to talk to you. Maybe that's how this works. The universe throws people together right when they need each other most, even if they don't realize it yet." Before I could process that statement or figure out if he was being philosophical or if the cancer had spread to his brain and was making him say weird things, Vernon pulled out a leather checkbook from his coat pocket. An actual checkbook. I hadn't seen someone use one of those in years. Most people paid for Uber through the app, and even the elderly passengers usually had their grandkids set up Apple Pay or something. But Vernon opened that checkbook like it was the most natural thing in the world, pulled out a pen that probably cost more than my car payment, and started writing with slow, deliberate strokes. "What are you doing?" I asked, suddenly nervous because this felt like it was heading somewhere I wasn't equipped to handle. "I'd like to give you something," he said, still writing, his handwriting surprisingly steady for someone who'd just admitted he was 3 weeks away from death. "Not for the ride. The app will handle that. This is for listening. For not treating me like I'm already dead. For making me laugh about Minneapolis traffic when I told you about my son." "Sir, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he interrupted, signing the check with a flourish that suggested he'd signed thousands of these over his lifetime. "That's precisely why I want to." He tore the check from the book with a satisfying rip, folded it twice with precise creases, and held it out to me. "Promise me something, though." I took the check, feeling the expensive paper between my fingers, but I didn't look at it yet because Vernon was staring at me with an intensity that demanded my full attention. "Promise you what?" "Call your father tonight," he said, and his voice had that quality that made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. It was a directive from a dying man who'd earned the right to make demands. "I don't care what you fought about. I don't care how long it's been. I don't care if it's awkward or uncomfortable or if you think it won't change anything. Call him." "Sir, my dad and I barely talk. We had a falling out 3 years ago about. It's complicated. We're just better off not." "There's no such thing as better off when it comes to family." Vernon cut me off, and now there was steel in his voice, the kind of authority that came from decades of running a company and making people listen whether they wanted to or not. You think you have time to fix things later, but later disappears faster than you can imagine. I thought I'd have time to fix things with Thomas. I thought we'd have another argument, and another, and eventually we'd figure it out, because that's what fathers and sons do, right? They fight and make up and fight again, and it's all part of the process. He paused, swallowing hard, and I realized this man was on the verge of tears in my back seat. But sometimes there is no later. Sometimes later is just an excuse we tell ourselves so we don't have to do the hard thing today. So promise me, call your father. Tonight. Not tomorrow, not next week, tonight. The check in my hand felt heavier than paper should. Okay, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I promise. Vernon nodded, satisfied, and some of the tension left his shoulders. He reached for the door handle, preparing to get out into the rain that was still falling like the sky was personally mourning his impending death. But before he opened the door, he turned back one more time. You can't fix the past, son, he said, and the way he said son made my throat tight. But you can stop repeating it. That's the only real power we have, to break the cycles that broke us. Then he was gone, stepping out into the rain with that expensive coat and those polished shoes, closing the door gently behind him. I watched him walk toward the hotel entrance, moving slowly but with dignity, and he turned back once under the awning. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and sadness and hope all mixed together. I sat there for a long moment after he disappeared into the hotel, my hazard lights still blinking, rain drumming on the roof, feeling like I'd just been hit by an emotional freight train that I never saw coming. Finally, I looked down at the check in my hand, unfolding it carefully. The number made me do a double take, so hard I nearly gave myself whiplash. I held it up to the dome light, convinced I was reading it wrong, convinced that my sleep-deprived brain was adding zeros that didn't exist. But no, there it was, written in Vernon Claiborne's steady handwriting, $30,000. $30,000. The memo line said simply, "For listening." I laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound that echoed in the empty car. Then I cried, ugly tears that came out of nowhere and everywhere all at once. Tears for Vernon and his dead son, and his 3 weeks left, and my own broken life, and every regret I'd been carrying around like it was my full-time job. The whole car smelled like old fries and expensive cologne, and the specific brand of grief that comes from realizing a complete stranger had just changed your life in the span of 45 minutes. I drove back to my usual spot behind the Walmart like a man operating on autopilot. Except autopilot was malfunctioning and kept replaying the last 45 minutes on an endless loop. The rain hadn't stopped. If anything, it had gotten more aggressive, like it was trying to wash away the entire city or at least make a solid attempt at flooding my consciousness with metaphorical symbolism. My windshield wipers kept up their squeaky protest, and I realized I'd been driving for 20 minutes without accepting any new ride requests because my brain had temporarily shut down all non-essential functions to process what the hell had just happened. I parked in my usual corner spot, killed the engine, and just sat there in the sudden silence that felt louder than the rain. The check was still in my hand. I'd been clutching it so hard during the drive back that my palm was sweaty, and I was worried I might accidentally smudge the ink and somehow invalidate $30,000 through sheer nervous perspiration. I unfolded it again, smoothing out the creases on my dashboard, holding it up to the gray morning light filtering through my windshield like I was some kind of currency inspector checking for counterfeit bills. $30,000. Written in actual ink, on actual paper, from an actual checkbook like we were living in 1987. The signature at the bottom, Vernon Claiborne, was elegant, confident, the signature of a man who'd signed important documents his entire life and never once doubted whether the check would clear. In the top left corner was a bank name I recognized. One of those old money institutions that probably required a certain net worth just to walk through their doors without security escorting you out. I thought maybe it was a typo. Like, perhaps Vernon had meant to write 3,000 or 300, and in his dying man emotional state, he'd accidentally added a zero. Or 2 zeros. But no, the amount was written out in words too, $30,000/$100. There was no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. This dying pharmaceutical executive had just handed his Uber driver enough money to fundamentally alter the trajectory of his life, with a memo line that simply said for listening. Like listening was some kind of rare commodity worth more than most people's annual salary. My whole car smelled like shock. If shock had a smell, which it doesn't, but if it did, it would be a combination of old fries, cheap air freshener, expensive cologne, and the specific scent of disbelief mixed with tears. I realized I was still crying, which was embarrassing even though nobody was around to witness it. When's the last time I'd cried? Really cried, not just teared up during a particularly emotional commercial or when I found out Biscuit had run away. Probably the day the divorce was finalized and I had to sign papers that legally dissolved 5 years of my life into a document that got filed in a government office somewhere and forgotten. But this was different. These weren't sad tears or angry tears or even particularly happy tears. These were what the hell just happened tears, the kind that come from your soul getting sucker punched by unexpected kindness from a complete stranger who was 3 weeks away from death and decided to spend part of his remaining time making sure a broke Uber driver might have a chance at not being broke anymore. I pulled out my phone, checked my bank account because that's what you do when you're holding a check that could potentially solve most of your immediate financial problems. Balance: $847.32. That was it. That was everything I had to my name after 5 years of building a business and a life that had been systematically dismantled by betrayal and bad luck. $847 stood between me and complete financial catastrophe, and I'd been living on that edge for so long I'd started to think it was normal, like maybe everyone was one missed car payment away from sleeping in their vehicle. But $30,000? That was breathing room. That was security deposit and first month's rent on an actual apartment, instead of crashing on my buddy Marcus's couch and pretending I was between places, instead of admitting I was homeless. That was fixing the weird noise my Honda had been making for 3 months that I'd been ignoring because I couldn't afford a mechanic. That was not having to choose between eating dinner and putting gas in my tank. That was dignity, actual, tangible dignity in check form. The sun was starting to rise, weak and watery behind the rain clouds, and the Walmart parking lot was filling up with early morning shoppers and employees starting their shifts. I watched a woman park 3 spots over, juggling an umbrella and a coffee, and a toddler who clearly didn't want to be awake at 7 in the morning. Life was just continuing around me like normal, like the entire universe hadn't just shifted on its axis during a random airport pickup. Vernon's voice echoed in my head. "Promise me you'll call your father tonight." I looked at my phone, at my dad's contact information that I hadn't touched in 3 years except for the obligatory "Merry Christmas" text that we'd exchanged last December, like 2 people checking off a social obligation. Our falling out had been stupid. One of those arguments that starts about something small and snowballs into something massive because both people are too proud to back down. He'd said something critical about my business when it was struggling, something about how I should have been more careful, should have seen Miranda's betrayal coming, should have protected myself better. I'd responded by telling him he didn't understand anything about my life, and maybe if he'd been a better father, I would have learned how to pick better partners. It was cruel and unfair, and we both knew it. But instead of apologizing, we just stopped talking. 3 years of silence because 2 grown men couldn't figure out how to say, "I'm sorry," without it feeling like admitting defeat. I sat there in that Walmart parking lot for another hour, watching the rain slowly taper off into a drizzle, holding a $30,000 check from a dying man who'd made me promise to break a cycle I didn't even realize I was perpetuating. Finally, around 8:30 in the morning, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I called my dad. He picked up on the first ring, which surprised me. His voice came through my car speakers via Bluetooth, sounding older than I remembered, rough with sleep or emotion or both. "Liam, you okay?" Not "hello." Not "this is unexpected." Just immediate concern that something was wrong because why else would his estranged son be calling him at 8:30 on a random Thursday morning? It made my chest hurt. The realization that despite 3 years of silence, his first instinct was still to worry about whether I was okay. "Yeah," I said, and my voice cracked embarrassingly. "Yeah, Dad, I'm okay. I paused, trying to figure out how to explain what had just happened without sounding completely insane. I just met a guy who reminded me that we're both still alive, and that maybe that matters more than whatever stupid thing we've been fighting about." There was a long pause on the other end, The kind of pause that contains entire conversations that don't need to be spoken out loud. I could hear him breathing, could imagine him sitting in his kitchen with his morning coffee, trying to process why his son was suddenly calling him with vague philosophical statements about mortality. "You sound like you've been crying," he said finally, his voice gentle in a way I'd forgotten it could be. "Nope," I lied automatically. "Just emotional allergies. Very severe. The pollen count is brutal today." He laughed, a short, surprised sound that I hadn't heard in 3 years. "It's been raining all morning, Liam. There's no pollen." "Okay, fine. I've been crying," I admitted. But in my defense, I just had possibly the weirdest and most emotionally devastating Uber ride of my entire career, and a dying millionaire just gave me $30,000 for listening to him talk about his dead son. And now I'm sitting in a Walmart parking lot having an existential crisis about family and regret, and whether I'm going to end up dying alone with nobody to talk to except random strangers. Another pause. Then, "Where are you?" "I'm coming to get you." "Dad, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he interrupted, and I realized where I'd gotten my stubbornness from. "Give me the address. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He lived 40 minutes away in Bloomington, but I gave him the address anyway because apparently this was happening whether I was ready for it or not. While I waited, I turned on the radio to avoid thinking too hard about what I'd just set in motion. Some classic rock station was playing Landslide by Fleetwood Mac, which felt aggressively on the nose for my current emotional state. But I listened anyway because when the universe decides to get poetic, you might as well lean into it. My dad showed up in 35 minutes, driving faster than he should have in post-rain conditions, which felt like its own kind of love language. He pulled up next to my Honda in his sensible Toyota Camry that he'd been driving since I was in high school, and when he got out, I realized he looked older too. More gray hair, deeper lines around his eyes, that slight stoop that comes from decades of carrying weight you can't put down. We stared at each other across the parking lot for a moment, two stubborn men who'd spent 3 years being too proud to admit they missed each other. Then he walked over and tapped on my window, and I rolled it down. "You look like hell," he said. "Thanks, Dad. Really feeling the love here." "Come on," he said, opening my door. "I'm buying you breakfast. Real breakfast, not whatever gas station garbage you've been surviving on." We ended up at a Perkins because that's where Midwestern fathers take their sons when emotional reconciliation requires pancakes. We sat across from each other in a booth that had probably witnessed 1,000 similar conversations, and we ate mediocre eggs and drank coffee that tasted like forgiveness tastes when it's been 3 years overdue, bitter, sweet, and necessary all at once. I woke up the next morning feeling like I'd been emotionally hangover. You know, that specific exhaustion that comes from crying, reconciling with your estranged father, and processing the fact that a dying stranger had handed you enough money to temporarily solve your life. My phone was buzzing on the floor next to Marcus's couch where I'd been crashing for the past 4 months, and I seriously considered ignoring it because it was 7 in the morning and whoever was calling me at this hour clearly didn't respect the universal law that nothing good happens before 8 a.m. But then I remembered the check and the possibility that maybe it was the bank calling to confirm that yes, this insane deposit was legitimate and not some elaborate prank, so I rolled off the couch. Literally rolled, because apparently I'd been sleeping in a position that had turned my spine into a pretzel, and grabbed my phone. Unknown number. Twin Cities area code. I answered with my professional Uber voice, the one I used when I was pretending to be a functional human being instead of a disaster held together by cheap coffee and denial. "Hello, Mr. Liam Henley?" The voice on the other end was male, crisp, with that particular cadence that lawyers develop where every word sounds like it's been carefully selected from a dictionary of formal speech. He pronounced my name correctly too, which was notable because half the people I encountered called me Liam, like I was some kind of Australian export. "Who's asking?" I said, because my natural instinct when someone uses my full name is to assume I'm either in trouble or about to be sold something I don't need. If this is about my car's extended warranty, I'm going to save us both some time and tell you I can barely afford the regular warranty. "This is Atticus Brandwell," he continued, completely unfazed by my sarcasm, which suggested he dealt with difficult people professionally. "I'm the senior partner at Brandwell & Associates, and I'm calling regarding Mr. Vernon Claiborne. I understand you drove him from the airport yesterday morning." My stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the sudden, terrible certainty that this conversation was about to go somewhere I wasn't prepared for. Yeah, I said slowly, sitting down on Marcus's couch because my legs suddenly felt unreliable. I drove him to the Grandview Hotel. Is he okay? There was a pause. One of those professionally calibrated pauses that lawyers use right before they deliver bad news that's going to fundamentally alter your understanding of reality. I'm afraid Mr. Claiborne passed away last night. Peacefully, in his sleep. The hotel staff found him this morning when he didn't respond to their wake-up call. The room tilted slightly, and I realized I'd stopped breathing. Vernon was dead. The man I'd spent 45 minutes with yesterday, who told me about his son and his regrets, and given me a check that was currently sitting in my wallet like a time bomb of generosity, was just gone. 3 weeks, his doctor had said. He'd had 3 weeks. He'd gotten less than 24 hours. Mr. Henley? Are you still there? Yeah, I managed, my voice coming out weird and distant like it belonged to someone else. Yeah, I'm here. I'm sorry. I didn't know him well, but he seemed like a good man. He was, Atticus said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice now, the kind that suggested this wasn't just a client to him, but someone he'd actually cared about. Which is why I'm calling. Mr. Claiborne contacted me yesterday afternoon, shortly after you dropped him at his hotel. He made some significant changes to his will. Oh no. Oh God. I knew where this was going, and every cell in my body wanted to hang up the phone and pretend this conversation had never happened, because there was no version of reality where this ended well for me. Mr. Henley, you're named in the will. Named as what? I said, trying to keep my voice light, trying to joke my way out of whatever cosmic insanity was about to be dropped on my head. His therapist? His Uber driver of the year? The guy who made him laugh about traffic one time. As his heir, Atticus said calmly, like he was informing me about the weather instead of completely derailing my entire understanding of how the universe worked. Specifically, you've been designated as the primary beneficiary of his estate. He left you everything. Approximately $89 million in liquid assets, controlling shares of Claiborne Pharmaceuticals, several properties including his residence in Edina, and various other holdings that we'll need to discuss in detail. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud. A sharp, hysterical sound that echoed in Marcus's living room and probably woke him up in his bedroom down the hall. Sir, I said, still laughing because the alternative was screaming or possibly passing out. I think you've got the wrong Liam Henley. There's probably another one somewhere in the Twin Cities who isn't currently living on his friend's couch and powered by instant noodles. You should try calling him instead. No, Mr. Henley. Atticus replied with the patience of someone who'd clearly dealt with people in shock before. Vernon was very specific. He left detailed instructions, and he also left you a letter. I think you'll want to sit down for this, if you're not already sitting down, that is. I'm sitting, I said, gripping the edge of the couch like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly started spinning off its axis. I'm very, very sitting. Would you be able to come to my office this afternoon? I'm located downtown, and I think it would be beneficial to discuss this in person. I'll also need to verify your identity and walk you through the legal requirements of inheriting an estate of this size. Also, Vernon's letter, he specifically requested that you read it in the presence of his family. His family, I said, confused. I thought he said he didn't have any family left. Not immediate family, Atticus clarified. But there are some distant relatives who were contacted regarding his passing. They'll be at the reading this afternoon as well. 2 p.m., if that works for you. I looked around Marcus's living room, at the pile of my clothes in the corner that I kept meaning to organize, at my laptop that was held together with duct tape, at the life I'd been living for the past 6 months that could generously be described as barely functional. Then I looked at my phone, at the timestamp that said 7:04 a.m., and realized I had approximately 7 hours to process the fact that a dying man I'd met for 45 minutes had apparently decided to leave me his entire fortune. Yeah, I said, my voice hollow. Yeah, 2 p.m. works. Can you text me the address? Of course. And Mr. Henley? Congratulations. Not everyone gets a second chance like this. After he hung up, I just sat there on Marcus's couch, staring at my phone like it might suddenly offer some explanation for what was happening to my life. Marcus emerged from his bedroom about 5 minutes later, squinting against the morning light, wearing boxer shorts and a t-shirt that said, I'm not arguing. I'm just explaining why I'm right. Dude, he said, yawning. Why are you awake? And why do you look like you've seen a ghost? I think I might have, I said quietly. Or maybe I'm about to become one. I can't tell anymore. Marcus stared at me, clearly trying to determine if I was having some kind of mental breakdown or if this was just standard Liam behavior. You want to elaborate on that cryptic nonsense? Or are we doing the whole mysterious protagonist thing today? So I told him. I told him everything. About Vernon, about the ride, about the $30,000 check that was still in my wallet, about the phone call I'd just received from a lawyer with a name that sounded like he belonged in a Jane Austen novel. Marcus listened with increasing disbelief, his eyes getting wider with every sentence, until finally he just sat down on the couch next to me and said the only thing that made sense. Holy shit. Yeah, I agreed. Holy shit. So you're telling me, Marcus said slowly, processing, that you gave a dying millionaire a ride from the airport. He liked you so much he gave you 30 grand. Then he went back to his hotel and literally rewrote his will to leave you everything. And then he died? All in less than 24 hours. That appears to be the situation, yes. That's insane. That's literally insane. That doesn't happen in real life. That happens in movies where the plot is so contrived everyone complains about it being unrealistic. And yet, I said, holding up my phone with Atticus's text message containing the address of Brandwell and Associates. Here we are, living in a contrived movie plot. Marcus leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling like it might have answers. So what are you going to do? I'm going to go to this meeting, I said, standing up because sitting still felt impossible now. I'm going to read whatever letter Vernon left me. I'm going to meet his family, who probably hate me already because some random Uber driver is inheriting everything while they get nothing. And then I'm probably going to have a complete nervous breakdown in a lawyer's office, which seems fitting given how my life's been going lately. You need me to come with you? Marcus asked, and the fact that he offered without hesitation reminded me why he'd been letting me crash on his couch for 4 months without complaint. Nah, I said, heading toward the bathroom because I suddenly realized I needed to shower and look like someone who could theoretically be trusted with $89 million. But if you don't hear from me by 5 p.m., assume I've been murdered by angry relatives and call the police. That's not funny, Marcus called after me. Who said I was joking? I yelled back, turning on the shower and watching the water run while I tried to mentally prepare for what was about to be either the best or worst afternoon of my entire life. Spoiler alert, it was going to be both. The offices of Brandwell and Associates occupied the entire 14th floor of a downtown building that made my Honda look like a sad joke on wheels. Everything about the place screamed old money in a way that was both intimidating and vaguely offensive. Like the furniture itself was judging me for showing up in khakis from Target and a button-up shirt I'd borrowed from Marcus because everything I owned was either wrinkled, stained, or both. The reception area smelled like leather and wood polish and the quiet confidence that comes from generations of wealthy people solving their problems with expensive lawyers. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with perfect posture and a smile that suggested she'd perfected the art of being professionally pleasant, directed me to a conference room down a hallway lined with portraits of stern-looking men who'd probably never driven an Uber in their lives. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see several people already seated, and my stomach did that thing where it tries to escape through your throat because you're about to walk into a situation you're catastrophically unprepared for. Atticus Brandwell met me at the door. He was exactly what you'd expect from a lawyer named Atticus. 60-something, silver hair, expensive suit that probably cost more than I'd made in the last 6 months, and reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck like he was actively cosplaying as everyone's distinguished grandfather. He shook my hand with the firm grip of someone who'd spent decades negotiating deals that moved millions of dollars. Mr. Henley, he said warmly, thank you for coming. I know this must be overwhelming. That's one word for it, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Other words include surreal, terrifying. And is this a prank show? Because if it is, the production value is incredible. He smiled, a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. I assure you, this is quite real. Please, come in. There are some people I'd like you to meet. I followed him into the conference room, and immediately every eye turned to look at me. There were 4 other people seated around a massive wooden table that looked like it had witnessed more important conversations than I'd had in my entire life. 2 older women who I immediately pegged as distant relatives based on their matching expressions of polite confusion mixed with barely concealed resentment. A younger guy, maybe early 40s, in a business suit that screamed middle management, looking at me like I was a math problem he couldn't solve. And then, sitting at the far end of the table, was someone who made my brain short-circuit entirely. My dad. What? I started, but my dad held up his hand, looking just as confused as I felt. Liam, I got a call from Mr. Brandwell's office this morning. They said I needed to be here. Something about family records, and I don't understand what's happening any more than you do. Atticus gestured for me to sit, then took his position at the head of the table like a conductor preparing to lead an orchestra through a particularly complicated symphony. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. I know this is unusual, and I appreciate your patience. As you all know, Vernon Claiborne passed away yesterday morning. His death, while not unexpected given his diagnosis, came sooner than anticipated. One of the older women, she had that pursed-lipped look of someone who'd spent her entire life being mildly disappointed by everything, cleared her throat. Mr. Brandwell, I don't mean to be rude, but why is there a stranger at this reading? We're family, however distant, and this young man is. Essential to understanding Vernon's final wishes, Atticus interrupted smoothly, which will become clear momentarily. Now, if we could proceed. He pulled out a manila envelope that looked like it contained either extremely important documents or the instructions for some kind of elaborate treasure hunt. Vernon left a letter that he requested be read aloud in the presence of everyone gathered here today. Mr. Henley, this is primarily addressed to you, but its contents concern everyone in this room. He opened the envelope and pulled out several sheets of paper covered in handwriting. Vernon's handwriting, I realized, the same elegant script I'd seen on the $30,000 check. Atticus cleared his throat and began to read, and I swear to God, the temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. Liam, Atticus read, his voice taking on a softer quality. If you're hearing this, I'm gone. Faster than expected, probably, because that's how pancreatic cancer works. It doesn't care about timelines or unfinished business. I know you'll want to refuse this inheritance. You'll think it's too much, that you don't deserve it, that there's been some mistake. But I need you to listen to what I'm about to tell you, because it's going to change how you understand everything. I felt my dad's eyes on me, but I couldn't look at him. I was frozen, every muscle in my body locked in place, while Atticus continued. After my son Thomas died, my wife Eleanor and I searched desperately for his girlfriend. We knew he'd been serious about someone, that they'd been talking about getting married, but he'd kept the relationship private because I'd been difficult about his personal life the same way I was difficult about his professional life. Her name was Margaret Henley. My dad made a sound, a sharp intake of breath that was almost a gasp. I turned to look at him, and his face had gone completely white. Margaret, my dad whispered. My sister Margaret. The room was spinning now, or maybe I was spinning and the room was staying still. I couldn't tell anymore. Atticus continued reading, his voice steady even as he delivered information that was systematically destroying my understanding of reality. Margaret was pregnant when Thomas died. She was only 23, scared, and alone. We tried to find her, hired private investigators, contacted every Henley in Minnesota, but she disappeared. Eleanor and I spent years wondering about that child, about our grandchild who we'd never meet, who would grow up never knowing they were part of our family. It became Eleanor's obsession in her final years, before Alzheimer's took her memory. She'd talk about finding the baby, even when she couldn't remember my name. One of the older women was crying now, soft tears that she was trying to hide behind a tissue. The younger guy in the business suit just looked confused, like he'd shown up for a regular while reading and accidentally walked into a soap opera. Yesterday, Atticus continued, my private investigator, whom I'd kept on retainer for 15 years, just in case, finally found something. Adoption records. Margaret gave birth to a son in 1991. She died 2 years later from complications of lupus, and the child was adopted by her brother. Atticus paused, looking at my dad, Daniel Henley, and his wife Rebecca. The silence in that conference room was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. My dad was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Shock, realization, grief, and something that might have been relief all mixed together in a way that made him look 10 years older. "Wait," I said, and my voice came out strangled. "Wait, are you saying?" "The child Margaret gave birth to," Atticus read. "Her son, Thomas's son, is you, Liam. You're my grandson." The world tilted sideways. I heard someone say, "Oh my God," but couldn't tell if it was me or someone else in the room. My dad had his face in his hands now, shoulders shaking, and I realized he was crying. Actually crying, something I'd seen maybe twice in my entire life. "You reminded me of my boy, not just in name," Atticus continued, his own voice starting to crack slightly, "but in heart, in spirit, in that stubborn refusal to give up even when everything's falling apart. When you told me about your business, about your divorce, about losing everything, I saw Thomas. And when you made me laugh about Minneapolis traffic right after I told you about the worst moment of my life, I knew. I knew you were someone who understood that humor isn't disrespect, it's survival." I couldn't breathe. The room was too small, too bright, too full of people watching me process information that should have come with a manual or at least a warning label. "I have 3 weeks, the doctors said. I'm using one day to make sure you get what should have been yours all along. Not just money, but family. A history. A place to belong. You listened when I needed forgiveness most. You called your father because I asked you to. You're already more of a grandson than I deserve, and you didn't even know it yet." My dad stood up suddenly, walked around the table, and pulled me into a hug that nearly knocked me off my chair. "I'm so sorry," he was saying over and over. "I'm so sorry I never told you. We were going to. We always meant to, but you were so young when Rebecca died, and then it never seemed like the right time, and—" "Dad," I managed, my voice muffled against his shoulder. "Dad, I can't, I know this is a lot," Atticus read, wiping his own eyes now. "I know you'll have questions, and I'm sorry I'm not there to answer them. But I've left detailed records, letters from Margaret, photos of Thomas, everything I could compile. You deserve to know where you came from. And Thomas, wherever he is, deserved to know his son turned out to be exactly the kind of man he would have been proud of." I pulled away from my dad, looking around the conference room at these strangers who were suddenly, impossibly, family. The older women were both crying openly now. The guy in the business suit looked like he was trying to process quantum physics while underwater. And me? I laughed. Nervous, ugly, hysterical laughter that echoed off the expensive wood paneling and probably violated some kind of sacred law about maintaining dignity in law offices. "Of course," I said, still laughing even as tears streamed down my face. "Of course. Why not find out the dying millionaire is my secret grandpa? That tracks. That absolutely tracks with how my life has been going." Then I stopped laughing and started crying instead. Deep, ugly sobs that I'd been holding in for months or maybe years. Grief for grandparents I'd never known. For a biological father who'd died before I was born. For a mother who'd given me up because she was too young and too sick to keep me. For a grandfather who'd found me in the back of a Honda and had exactly one day to be my family before the universe took him away too. 3 weeks after Vernon's funeral, which was attended by approximately 400 people including politicians, pharmaceutical executives, and 2 very confused relatives who'd just discovered they were related through a tragic web of secrets and bad timing, I got another call from Atticus Brandwell. This time, I answered with significantly less panic because I'd spent the past 21 days in a surreal blur of legal paperwork, bank meetings, and intense therapy sessions where I tried to explain to a professional that yes, I'd inherited $89 million from my dead grandfather, who I'd met once while driving him from the airport. And no, I wasn't handling it particularly well. "Thank you for asking, Liam," Atticus said, and I'd gotten used to his voice now. That calm, measured tone that suggested nothing could possibly surprise him anymore. "There's someone I'd like you to meet. Another piece of the puzzle, if you will. Are you available this afternoon?" I looked around the apartment I'd just signed a lease on, my first non-couch living situation in 6 months, which was currently furnished with exactly 1 folding chair and a sense of overwhelming disorientation. "Yeah," I said. "I'm available. What kind of puzzle piece are we talking about here? Because if it's another secret relative, I'm going to need advance warning and possibly medication." Atticus chuckled. "Not a secret exactly. Just someone who has been looking for family as long as Vernon was. His name is Sean Henley." He's your cousin, Thomas's other son. The phone nearly slipped out of my hand. I'm sorry, Thomas's what now? Margaret wasn't Thomas's only relationship, Atticus explained patiently. Before he met her, he dated a woman named Sarah Chun. They broke up when Thomas was 25, and Sarah discovered she was pregnant shortly after. She tried to contact him, but he'd already started dating Margaret and, well, it's complicated. Sarah raised the child alone, eventually married someone else, and their son Sean grew up knowing his biological father had died before he was born, but never knowing who he was. Jesus Christ, I muttered, sitting down on my one folding chair because standing felt like too ambitious an activity given this new information. How many secret relatives am I going to discover? Is this going to be a weekly thing? Should I just start planning for surprise family members to emerge from the woodwork every Thursday? Just Sean, as far as we know, Atticus said with what sounded like amusement. Vernon's investigator found him about 2 years ago, but Vernon wanted to meet him in person and his health kept declining. They'd been planning a meeting that never happened. When I contacted Sean about Vernon's death and explained the family connection, he expressed interest in meeting you. If you're comfortable with that. Comfortable wasn't the word I'd use. Terrified, overwhelmed, curious in that way you're curious about whether you can fit your entire fist in your mouth. Technically possible, but probably a bad idea. Yeah, I said finally. Yeah, okay. Where and when? We met at a coffee shop in St. Paul, neutral territory, Atticus had suggested, somewhere public, but not too crowded. I arrived 15 minutes early because apparently inheriting millions of dollars hadn't cured my anxiety-driven punctuality, and I ordered a coffee I didn't drink because my hands needed something to do besides shake. At exactly 2 p.m., a man walked in who made me do a double take so hard I nearly spilled my untouched beverage. Sean Henley looked like someone had taken a photo of Vernon, aged it backwards about 50 years, and added a healthy dose of Asian features that must have come from his mother. He was maybe 35, tall, with Thomas's same dark hair and Vernon's intense eyes, wearing jeans and a hoodie that suggested he was approximately as comfortable with this situation as I was. When our eyes met across the coffee shop, there was this moment of mutual recognition, not because we knew each other, but because we were both walking evidence of the same complicated family history. He walked over, and we both just stood there for a second like two people who'd been told to hug, but weren't sure if that's what you did when meeting the cousin you didn't know existed until 3 weeks ago. Finally, he stuck out his hand and said, "So, this is weird, right? I'm not the only one finding this incredibly weird." I shook his hand, laughing despite myself. "Oh my God, thank you. Everyone keeps acting like discovering secret relatives is totally normal, and I've been feeling crazy for thinking this is the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me." "Right," Sean said, sitting down across from me with visible relief. "My wife keeps telling me to process my feelings and explore this new connection, and I'm like, babe, I'm still processing the fact that I'm apparently related to a pharmaceutical empire. The feelings are going to have to wait their turn." We talked for 3 hours. Not about money or inheritances or legal complications. We talked about growing up not knowing where we came from, about that specific flavor of confusion that comes from being told you're adopted but never getting the full story. Sean had been raised by his mom and stepdad in St. Paul, had 3 kids of his own, worked as an architect, and had spent his entire life with this vague sense that there was information missing from his personal narrative. "I always thought I was unwanted," Sean admitted, stirring his 3rd coffee of the afternoon. "Like, my biological father didn't want me, which is why he wasn't in the picture. Finding out he never knew I existed, that he died before he could know, that's somehow worse and better at the same time." "Yeah," I said, understanding exactly what he meant. It's like, you can't be mad at a dead guy, but you're also mad that the universe didn't give him the chance to know you existed. It's complicated grief for someone you never met, but were supposed to be connected to. Exactly. Sean leaned forward, animated now. "And then finding out Vernon spent years looking for family, that he died knowing about you, but not about me. God, I don't even know how to feel about that. Relieved I wasn't rejected? Sad I missed the chance to meet him? Angry that there was this whole family history I could have been part of? All of the above," I suggested. "I think you're allowed to feel all of it simultaneously. Grief doesn't follow logic." We exchanged phone numbers, made tentative plans to meet again with our respective families. My dad, his mom, his wife and kids, the distant relatives from the law office who turned out to be second cousins twice removed, or something equally complicated. We created a group chat that we ironically titled The Surprise Henley Family Reunion Nobody Asked For. We laughed about it because laughing was easier than crying, even though we both probably needed to do more of the latter. A week later, we attended Vernon's actual memorial service together, not the funeral, which had been the massive public affair with news coverage and pharmaceutical industry representatives, but a smaller, private memorial that Atticus had organized specifically for family. It was just us, my dad, Sean's mom Sarah, Sean's wife and kids, and the two older women from the law office whose names I'd learned were Helen and Patricia, Vernon's second cousins who'd spent their lives knowing him as the successful distant relative they saw at occasional holiday gatherings. The service was held at a small chapel in Edina, and everyone who spoke talked about Vernon the person, not Vernon the businessman. Helen told a story about how he'd paid for her son's medical school without ever mentioning it, how she'd only found out years later. Patricia described how he'd shown up unannounced at her husband's funeral and sat with her for 3 hours, not saying much, just being present. Sarah talked about how, when she'd finally tracked down Thomas's family after his death, Vernon had helped her financially even though they weren't related, because that's what you did for the mother of your son's child. When the priest asked if anyone else wanted to speak, I stood up before I could talk myself out of it. Walking to the front of that chapel felt like walking through water, but I got there eventually and turned to face this bizarre collection of people who were somehow my family now. I was Vernon's Uber driver. I started, and several people smiled because apparently Atticus had told them the story. We talked for 45 minutes about failure, ambition, regret, and how fast people disappear when you lose everything. He told me about his son. He showed me a photo. He cried in my back seat while telling me about an argument that ended with death, and I had no idea I was looking at pictures of my biological father. My voice cracked, but I pushed through. Vernon gave me $30,000 for listening to him. That's what the memo line said, for listening. Like listening was some rare commodity worth more than most people's annual salary. And maybe it is. Maybe in a world where everyone's rushing to the next thing, stopping to actually hear someone's story, really hear it, not just wait for your turn to talk. Maybe that's worth everything. I paused, looking at Sean, at my dad, at this collection of people who'd been scattered by time and circumstance and brought back together by one old man's determination to fix what he could before he died. Vernon spent 15 years looking for family he never got to meet. He found me by accident, in the back of a Honda that smelled like old fries, and he decided that was enough. That 45 minutes was enough to build a bridge across decades of loss. Tears were streaming down my face now, and I didn't even try to hide them. People keep asking me what I'm going to do with the money, how I'm going to handle the company, the properties, the responsibility, and honestly, I have no idea. But I know what Vernon would want me to do with the family, the actual family, the people in this room who are connected by tragedy and love, and the stubborn refusal to let one generation's pain become the next generation's prison. I looked directly at Sean. He'd want us to know each other, to break the cycle of silence and secrets that kept us apart, to stop letting pride and fear and complicated grief keep us from the people who are supposed to matter most. After the service, we all went to a diner, because apparently that's the Henley family way of processing emotions, over mediocre coffee and breakfast food served at inappropriate times of day. Sean's kids ran around being delightfully chaotic while the adults tried to map out family trees on napkins and kept getting confused about who was related to whom and how. My dad and Sarah had a long conversation about Margaret, sharing memories of a woman who'd been too young and too sick to raise her son, but had loved him enough to make sure he had a family who could. Helen and Patricia told stories about Vernon that made him seem less like an intimidating pharmaceutical executive and more like a complicated man who'd spent his life trying to atone for one terrible argument with his son. Money doesn't solve everything, but it sure as hell helps you think clearer when you're not choosing between dinner and rent. I learned that pretty quickly once the estate actually transferred and my bank account went from 3 digits to 9 digits, which remains the most surreal sentence I've ever had to process. For about a week, I just stared at my phone, refreshing my banking app like it might suddenly correct itself and reveal this had all been an elaborate prank. But it wasn't a prank, and Vernon's fortune came with something more valuable than the money itself. it came with purpose. I knew exactly what he'd want me to do with it, because he'd told me in that Honda, break the cycle. Stop repeating the past. Use what you've been given to help people who are drowning the way we both drowned. So I restarted Greendale Gardens, not landscapes, gardens, because I wanted it to be about growth, not just maintenance. My brother Jake, who'd been working construction and hating every minute of it, became my partner. We hired people who'd lost their businesses, who'd been betrayed by partners, who were one bad month away from sleeping in their cars like I'd been. Our first employee was a 53-year-old woman named Carol whose bakery had failed after her husband cleaned out their joint account and disappeared to Florida with his 25-year-old secretary. Our second was a mechanic named Ray who'd lost his shop when his son's medical bills bankrupted the family. We called our charity wing the Claiborne Foundation for Second Chances because Vernon had given me one and I'd be damned if I wasn't going to pass it forward. Within 6 months, we'd helped 47 families, covering medical bills, restarting businesses, providing interest-free loans to people the banks had written off as bad investments. Every person who walked through our door got treated like they mattered, because Vernon had treated me like I mattered when I was nobody special. When Miranda heard about it, because of course she heard about it, bad news travels fast, but apparently, so does news about your ex-husband inheriting a pharmaceutical empire. She sent me a message. Just 3 words. Can we talk? I stared at that text for a full minute before responding with 4 words that gave me more satisfaction than they probably should have. Sure. My lawyer loves talking. We never did talk. Turns out when your ex-wife realizes you're no longer desperate, she suddenly has nothing to say. Funny how that works. The foundation became my full-time job, and Jake ran Greendale Gardens with the kind of passion I'd always wished I could have maintained before exhaustion and betrayal beat it out of me. We expanded into landscaping contracts with affordable housing developments, created job training programs, hired ex-convicts nobody else would give a chance to. Vernon's money was working harder than it ever had sitting in investment accounts, and every time we helped someone, I thought about that 45-minute ride and how one person deciding to see another person's humanity can change everything. Sometimes people asked me if I felt guilty, inheriting money from a man I'd known for less than an hour, getting a fortune I hadn't earned while other people worked their entire lives for scraps. And yeah, some days I felt guilty as hell. But then I'd remember Vernon's face when he talked about his son, remember how he'd said, "You can't fix the past, but you can stop repeating it." And I'd realize guilt was just another way of staying stuck. So I kept moving forward, kept writing checks to people who needed second chances, kept building the kind of legacy Vernon wished he'd built with Thomas. One based on forgiveness instead of regret, on listening instead of judging, on believing people deserve another shot, even when everything says they don't. I still drive Uber once a week, Thursday mornings, just to stay humble and remember where I came from. People think I'm insane when I tell them this. You're worth how much and you're still driving strangers around Minneapolis at 6 a.m.? Yeah, I am, because the moment I forget what it felt like to be invisible, desperate, and one broken windshield wiper away from a complete breakdown is the moment I become exactly the kind of person Vernon spent his life regretting being. My Honda's long gone. Donated it to a single mom who needed reliable transportation more than I needed the memories of rock bottom. Now I drive a decent Toyota that doesn't smell like existential crisis, and I've upgraded my air freshener game considerably. But the principle remains the same. Every Thursday, I log into the app, accept rides, and listen to people's stories like they matter, because they do. Last Thursday morning, I picked up a young woman from an apartment complex in Uptown. She got in my back seat, and I immediately recognized the look. The same exhausted, defeated expression I'd worn for 6 months straight. Red eyes that suggested she'd been crying recently, shoulders hunched like she was trying to take up as little space as possible in the world, that specific energy of someone whose dreams had just been systematically demolished. Rough morning, I asked, pulling away from the curb. She laughed, but it was one of those laughs that's actually just crying in disguise. Rough year more like. My restaurant failed. I put everything into it. My savings, my parents' life savings, maxed out every credit card, convinced all my friends to invest. And it just failed. Bad location, worse timing, and apparently I'm terrible at business even though I'm a great chef. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, seeing my own past reflected back at me with uncomfortable clarity. Let me guess, I said. Now your parents think you ruined their retirement, your friends aren't returning your calls, and you're questioning every decision you've ever made. She looked up, surprised. How did you, yeah? Exactly that. Been there, I said simply. Different business, same devastation. Lost everything including my dog, who apparently had standards about the kind of human he was willing to live with. That got a real laugh out of her, small but genuine. We drove in silence for a few minutes while she composed herself, and I thought about Vernon, about that rainy morning that had changed everything, about how he'd looked at me and seen his son instead of just another Uber driver, about how one person deciding to care can alter the entire trajectory of someone's life. At a red light, I reached into my glove compartment and pulled out one of the business cards Weed had printed for the foundation. I handed it back to her. Someone once believed in me when I didn't deserve it, I said, when I was drowning and convinced I'd never surface. This is a foundation that helps people restart after failure. No judgment, no lectures about what you should have done differently, just resources and support. Give them a call. She took the card, studying it with confusion. Why would a stranger help me? What's the catch? No catch, I said as the light turned green. Just paying forward something that was given to me. Because sometimes family isn't who you're born to. It's who fate throws into your car in the middle of a thunderstorm when you both need saving. She looked at me like I'd just spoken in riddles, but she pocketed the card anyway. When I dropped her off at her destination, she paused before getting out. Thank you, she said quietly. Not just for the ride. Thank Vernon, I replied. He's the one who taught me that listening matters more than advice, and that second chances aren't just for people who deserve them. They're for everyone who's brave enough to try again. After she left, I sat in my car for a moment, thinking about how many people are out there right now, drowning in failure and convinced they're invisible. Thinking about how Vernon had seen me when I felt most invisible, had decided 45 minutes was enough time to build a bridge across decades of grief and loneliness and regret. I keep Vernon's business card in my wallet, the one from his final ride, slightly worn now from being carried around for over a year. On the back, in his distinctive handwriting, are the words that changed me forever. Every ending is just a beginning waiting for brave enough hands to build it. Every time I read those words, usually on Thursday mornings before my first pickup, I whisper the same thing. Thanks, Grandpa. And thanks for the tip. Then I turn on the app, accept the next ride, and go looking for the next person who needs to know they're not invisible. Because that's what family does. Real family, chosen family, the kind that gets built in the back of a Honda during a rainstorm when two broken people decide that maybe being broken together is better than being alone. Vernon gave me $89 million, controlling shares of a pharmaceutical company and properties I'm still discovering. But the real inheritance? It was the lesson that everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. And sometimes the most valuable thing you can give someone isn't money or advice or solutions. It's the simple act of seeing them, really seeing them, and deciding they matter. That's worth more than any fortune. And every Thursday morning, I get to pass it forward, one ride at a time.